They thought they knew what was best for those children, and Christine shouldn't have them.
The best witnesses in the world now are not human beings. They're devices. And they're watching and they're listening.
This family had a mission, and their mission was well documented.
We began to uncover and paint a picture of stalking. And the stalking was done primarily through the internet.
It felt like a huge part of my heart was gone.
No matter what the rules are, what the laws are, Chris always told me that crazy finds a way. My name is Stephanie Adams, and I was best friends with Christine and for as long as I can remember. This picture is Chris and I at the beach in Lewis. Chris is on the ground. I'm there with the hat on. Looks like that says August of 1986. This is somebody's birthday party. This is Christine and myself. I actually thought of her as a sister I never had. These were really good times. I've never seen the surveillance videos. Typically, if I'm looking for something online and a video about Christine pops up, I don't click it. I go away from it. It's pretty creepy. I never had a good vibe. I couldn't ever say there was anything good about David and the Matusowitzes. I just thought, there's so much crazy. There is so much. Things started out like how you want them to start out. Chris described David to me as, basically he was a great guy. She fell in love with this man and they had a beautiful wedding and went on with life and had this awesome family. She had 3 more daughters with him. She had a total of 4 girls.
They didn't live in the city itself. They lived in what you would call an exurb, beyond the suburbs. It was a large house with a large yard, and so it was quite comfortable. David was a successful optometrist. In fact, Christine worked for him, and that's how they met. And he was doing quite well financially.
I went to work with Chris. I didn't know a thing about selling contact lenses or glasses, and she could come into the office, say, hi, how are you, what's up? We could be best friends, and then she would switch over to instructor mode. And she was still able to do all of that very gracefully without sounding condescending.
I am Katie Maffa, and I am Christine's daughter from her first marriage. My mom, she was very loving. She was always there for us. She was super sweet and kind. She had a ton of friends. It was always a good time when my mom was around. We first moved in with David when I was 5 years old. Life was super fun. We had a pool and a swing set. There was always kids over from the neighborhood. We were just a fun house to be at.
Chris told me that her marriage began to crumble when his parents moved in. She felt like there was no discussion about it. They just showed up one day. He said, my parents are going to live with us. And that was where things started to go bad for them.
When you have 2 couples living in the same house, there's no house that's big enough for that. Thomas Matusowitz, David's father, had been a police officer in New Jersey. He lost his job under a cloud, He was kind of a grumpy person. We only learned much later how grumpy.
Lenore was just a strong-minded, stubborn, and overall not nice person. To live with her was difficult. She was always accusing me of doing like sneaky things, even though I was just a little kid. She was just always looking to get me in trouble with my mom. The whole thing was just weird.
I understand that Katie didn't fit well in with the family there, and that caused some tension between her and David.
Chris did become very uncomfortable in her own house. David's father apparently was a gun enthusiast, never had any qualms about mentioning that there were guns around the house and he knew how to use them. It was always a veiled threat, not an outright one that you could, I don't know, go to the police with. But she felt like she was being told she better keep herself in line.
I remember one time Thomas grabbed my mom by the arm and drug her out of the back door and was yelling at her on the back porch.
It culminated when David threatened her. He said that he could bury her body where nobody would find it. Christine envisioned that eventually they would split on, if not amicable terms, at least cordial terms, and the children would spend half the time with her and half the time with David.
He started off by saying I was bipolar and trying to have me committed so he could have the kids. And then they had Dr. Romorowski evaluate both of us.
The psychologist testified that Christine was fine, but David had some problems. The psychologist found that David was very rigid in his thinking, and if you presented him with facts that didn't conform to his way of thinking, he simply could not accept them. We had a meeting at the courthouse, and David wanted the children all to himself. Not only did he want them living with him full-time, but he wanted to have complete control over making decisions for the children's benefit. At that time, it was simply a matter of his controlling personality, I think, dominating Christine.
I met Chris through a good friend of mine. He was having a small get-together. It was love at first sight. This is when we first met. Usually she's smiling most of the time, 90% of the time smiling. Beautiful woman. She was the belle of the ball whenever we went to parties or out to dinner. Just a truly great person. She told me she was in the middle of a divorce. She was terrified of David. Totally terrified. In the back of her eyes, I can see it. Concern.
He doesn't have nearly the hold that he used to over me. I mean, the hold was so bad that when we first split up, I was so scared of him.
He had lost a beautiful, loving woman and wife. It was a shot to his ego. How dare you leave me? He was narcissistic. He was opinionated. He was almost like a mama's boy. He cared more about what mom and dad thought than what she thought. No one understood what kind of monster they were dealing with.
August, David told Christine that he would take the children with his mother, Lenore, for a vacation to Disney World in Florida, and then bring them back in time for the oldest girl, Laura, who was 5, to start kindergarten. Before they left, Laura, the oldest one, had told her mother over the phone that there were a lot of boxes in David's house, and we didn't interpret that as anything. We didn't know what that meant.
Christine had expressed to me, something's fishy. She didn't like it. I didn't like it. And they vanished into thin air.
When my mom first realized that the girls weren't coming back, I remember her being super panicky.
I called Laura to see how she was, and she was crying, saying they'd been stuck in the car for a very long time. And that didn't sound right because they were supposed to be taking a plane.
My name is Jeff Schreiner. 2007, I was a detective assigned to the Newcastle County Police Missing Persons Unit. When I first got the case, I just thought it was just another agitated mother at her ex-husband and wanted the kids back. It's her turn, and wanted the kids back right away. I tried calling David's cell phone. They went straight to voicemail. We started checking David Matusowicz's bank records and found the last time his credit card was used was in North Carolina. This has been 2 weeks since he'd been gone, and credit card should have been used more than just North Carolina. So that starts sending the red flags up that this may be more than just a father not returning his kids to their mother a little late. I had to go farther. I was able to get a search warrant for the home in Middletown, Delaware. This was the summertime and the fireplace had been used. Laying in the ashes was David Matusowicz and Christine's divorce papers. Also where we discovered a New Zealand bank account, ties to Canada, and various other little pieces of information that helped further our investigation.
Christine's worst fear was that she would never see the children again. She was angry, upset, emotional. It was a difficult time. You have to let law enforcement officials do what they do.
At this time in investigation, I worked on it daily. When I asked Thomas Matusowicz, David's father, has he spoken to his wife, his grandkids, or his son? He said no. I said, where did they go? They went to Disney World. I asked Thomas, how'd they get there? He didn't know. All those things didn't add up at all. My first thoughts is, obviously, he may be involved in this. We contacted Amy Gonzalez, that is David's sister, asked her basically the same question, and she provided identical answers that her father Thomas provided us. At that point, I assumed that the whole family was involved. So we had a problem on our hands. Christine told me she had recently spoken to a friend and learned that David had sold his optometry business in Newark, Delaware. You know, she wouldn't give me the exact amount that she sold it for, but it was well over $600,000. Christine Belford's attorney informed me of paperwork for a line of credit, which Christine needed to have signed for it to go through. He had forged this document to get $249,000.
It's your worst fear come true. It's not ever good when it's a stranger, but when it's your parent, I have a very hard time believing that a parent would do that.
She was very strong through all of this. I don't know how she did it. It was all with grace and dignity. She always appeared polished for all these interviews. Even though she hadn't slept the night before, she would go out there and put on her best face and try to do right by those kids.
I'm sitting here in Delaware trying to figure out where they could have gone, what they could be doing, searching on the internet, doing whatever I could to try to figure out why and where.
It was getting to a point where I didn't know if we'd ever find these children. And the more I learned about David, I didn't know what his real intent was.
I was trying to wrap my head around, what are you thinking? Obviously, they were trying to hurt Chris in any way possible. And the children were Chris's life. So the more damage you can do to the children or keep the children away from her, the more you can hurt her. So the children were just pawns in this game.
Chris obviously was devastated. Missed the children all the time. We emailed each other back and forth quite often. It's one of the things she said she needed to keep her busy, for me to tell her about my life and my kids, and she would reciprocate and tell me what was going on in her life. I know I will see my girls again. I can feel it. But at the same time, it feels like it's going to be a while. There's no sense in me being mad all the time or sad all the time. I don't think that is what God would want for me. It was sickening. I was heartbroken for her. It was hard. It was hard.
Jeff Schreiner made sure that I knew that he was working on the case and constantly looking and reading, and I knew he was working hard. And I knew just as hard as it was for me to go through that, it was hard for him to come back to me and tell me there was nothing he could tell me.
My name is William David with the United States Marshal Service, and my job is to locate fugitives. I trusted Jeff's intuition. Jeff had a feeling that there was something about this case.
We started looking at more banking records. As we go deeper into it, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars being moved between bank accounts, the Matusewicz family bank accounts, as well as offshore bank accounts.
There was an individual retirement account, an IRA, that was also cashed out, which gave approximately another $100,000. So in total, we're looking at a fugitive who has roughly $1 million to stay hidden, to stay on the run.
We noticed a $82,000 purchase of an RV recreational vehicle by Lenore Matusewicz.
Coming from Delaware down, we know there was a spotting where David fueled up the RV. We then know traveled southbound towards the top of Florida, started heading west, cross country into Texas.
U.S. Marshals did their magic, was able to determine that a piece of property was purchased in Edcouch, Texas, which is about 20 miles north of the Mexican border. Once we learned that Thomas Matusewicz purchased land in Texas, it was a short while later when I called Amy and spoke to her boyfriend, and he's the one that actually told me they were also moving to Texas.
This is video of Dr. David Matusewicz when he appeared on Delaware Tonight talking about healthy eyes during a medical segment in March 2003. In August 2007, police allege he left the country with his 3 daughters.
At this point, we've determined that he's crossed international lines, and the manhunt was really getting big, and we enlisted the help of Interpol. I pretty much gave all that part of the investigation over to the United States Marshal Service because they have a lot longer arms across the world than I do.
There are various different ways people stay in touch. They stay in touch through third parties, through people. We developed some information from multiple interviews that David was down in Panama. Once in Panama, David purchases a home and establishes himself. Must have at some point been tipped off that we were looking in Panama for him, at which point he packs up the RV again, starts to travel northbound through Costa Rica, ends up settling in Nicaragua.
We did put an all-points bulletin out to be on the lookout for a 33-foot RV with Delaware tags on it. It's not a very common vehicle in Nicaragua.
The actual location was off the beaten path. It was not in a very populated area. At that point, I am relying on the State Department to reach out to their personnel that are at the embassy in Nicaragua. They established some surveillance. They sat, they watched, they waited. I received an email telling me to call. There's information. I made the phone call, and within the first 10 seconds of that phone call, it was, we found them.
About 11:30 at night, U.S. Marshals and the Newcastle County Police detective came to my door and ringing the doorbell repeatedly, knocking on the door, very excited. We found them. And when they told me they were in Nicaragua, I was quite surprised.
I think she cried. I cried. We hugged. I think we hugged the U.S. Marshal Service people. I know she did. Incredible. Absolutely incredible.
To be able to put a smile on a mother's face, I mean, that's rewarding. You don't see it every day in law enforcement. So that is a memory that I'll take with me.
It's probably my favorite. It's Back in Mother's Arms. And this is Karen and Laura, and then Karen and Lee. They were found in Catalina, in Nicaragua, in a trailer park where they were calling themselves the Blancos. I actually read an article at some point that pretty much behind their backs, the locals were calling them the kidnappers. They knew something was wrong with them.
When my sisters first came back, the first night that they were in the house, I was actually scared to be in the house with them. They were actually super skinny. They had cavities in their teeth. Karen had pink eye in both eyes. They just didn't look like themselves.
David had told Laura, the oldest, that Christine had killed herself, that Mommy wasn't alive anymore. You can abuse children in different ways. Physical abuse is extremely harmful, but mental abuse, to tell a child their mother is dead, it's crazy. The sentence to me and to Christine wasn't enough. They had a good lawyer. They got the minimum of what they deserved, I think.
When David and Lenore first went to jail, there was a sense of relief and there was some time to just relax and enjoy the girls being back. But my mom knew that while they were in jail, she had to terminate their rights. before they got out again.
I filed a petition for termination of David's parental rights in early 2010. I think that was, in his mind, that was probably the last straw.
They thought they knew what was best for those children, and Christine shouldn't have them. They didn't want to share. They did not want to share. They were going to be selfish, stingy little kids and keep them all to themselves. I think that was all it was. These are mine. You can't have them. Like they were little possessions, little pawns. Chris always told me that crazy finds a way. No matter what, no matter, what the rules are, what the laws are, crazy will find a way.
"29 items, all about abuse, molestation. It's an abomination. Should have never been published or printed." Christine trained Lee to eat independently by throwing food on a filthy rug and then having Lee fight the dog for her food. Laura knew all about the G-spot and how to play the game Lick the Lollipop at the age of 5. Horrific. It was just another way for them to manipulate and hurt her. Obviously, it's total fabrication. If you knew Christine, you would never have an ounce of doubt what a great mother she was.
I was shocked when I first heard the allegations because it's my mom and I know that she never would do anything like that. And so I was like, why would they do this? After everything else they've done, why say something like this?
My name is Ed McAndrew. I served as the cybercrime coordinator for our U.S. Attorney's Office.
So as we look at the Grandmother's Impossible Choice website, we see Lenore's allegations of abuse against Christine, made in the form of what she calls an affidavit. Christine Belford searched for and found a convicted pedophile and kept his rap sheet under her mattress. Then she threatened to sell David's 3 blonde, white American girls for $50,000 each. Obviously created by the Matusowiczes. It's their story that they crafted. But how does this website get posted when Lenore Matusowicz is sitting in a jail cell with no access to the internet?
Never did they make those allegations once before they kidnapped him. But it's just like they just keep trying. They just throw all this money at the wall and see what sticks.
They have no idea they're being filmed. That shot pans out, you can see that it's being recorded from inside of a vehicle. Literally sitting, down the street from them, spying on them. We see at one point that Christine comes out from behind the truck to grab one of the girls.
To the Matusowicz family, the video showed gross abuse of the children by Christine.
I think any mom would get their kid out of the street. I think the child abuse would have been if she would have left her out in the street.
This video is then sort of repackaged, posted on YouTube, and weaponized.
Whatever price they had to pay, whoever they had to slander, however they had to go about doing it, they weren't beneath doing it.
I've got to stay on track, so I just keep fighting and put one foot in front of the other.
They worked on Christine mentally to try to break her, to strip her of hope, and to give up, to maybe say, okay, take the children. everything changed. The fear came back, concerns for the children, their safety, everything changed.
What am I going to do? It's never going to stop. He's never going to stop.
Chris frequently felt like she was being watched. Often when she was to and from school with the children or at a bus stop with one of the children, it was pretty routine that she felt like she was being watched. She said, "I don't know if I'm just paranoid." But religion helped Chris cope. Having faith in something bigger, she would spend time teaching the Sunday school classes to children at the church, and I believe it did help her a lot.
What the Matuzewicz family did was print out the Grandmother's Impossible Choice webpage and mail those documents to everyone in Christine Belford's life. They sent them to all the schools, the principals of all the schools where the children went. They sent them to Christine Belford's employer. They even sent them to the church in an effort to smear and defame and terrorize her everywhere she went.
Christine Belford was a Sunday school teacher at a Catholic church in Delaware. She resigned her position teaching first graders about Jesus because she felt that she could put them in danger just by being there.
The allegations were never made by anybody but the Matusowitzes, and so the court never found any reason to bring charges against Christine because they found there to be no basis for these allegations.
Walk me through your darkest moment.
I start praying because I don't know what else to do, because my faith has taught me pray your way out of these situations.
I think the campaign against my mom really started to take a toll on her. My mom was more depressed than any of us ever really knew. She did a very good job of hiding it from us and making at least my sisters think that everything was okay.
I feel like it's like I'm always dodging a bullet. I'm tired. I'm tired.
Christine, needed support, needed to believe in the goodness of people.
Cindy Bender added my mom on Facebook and sent her a message saying like, "Hi, I'd been following the story and I just wanted to reach out and, make sure you guys are okay."
I think Cindy was an ex-girlfriend of David's. I think she was angry with David and was looking out for Christine's concern.
She would send little gifts to the girls and she would always ask like how their week was going in school and what sports they were in, and it was just nice to have another person asking about them. My mom shared information with Cindy about the girls' schools and their grades and what sports they were playing. She would update her with pictures of the girls.
I remember speaking with Christine about this and basically telling her I don't trust her, so we need to watch who we're talking to and sharing information.
At one point, Thomas Matuzewitz and Lenore Matuzewitz drive from Texas unannounced to the doorstep of Christine Belford's house. Christine's not there. Her children are. Her children are cowering upstairs because they realize who's outside the door.
My sisters were terrified when they realized that Thomas was at our house. I tried to take them into the bedroom and shut the door so they wouldn't see him or hear him, but they were still scared.
Christine's friend answers the door, there's an exchange, and they go.
For him to come to the house and knock on the door was pretty brazen. We had a restraining order against any of the family members coming to the household. So for him to do that was a serious red flag.
She's completely tormented by this. And you know what she does? She tries to sell her house. She tries to sell her house because she knows, they know where she lives. And what happens?
A real estate agent happened by one day. We're just in the area looking at houses. Would you be interested in selling? Christine was interested, and the realtor took pictures of every room, the front, the back, every room. So at that point, I had told Christine, well, we should limit any communications to people unless we know them personally, coming into the house, coming around the property.
I think that when so many people tell you that you're being paranoid and you're crazy, the people aren't following you, nobody's watching you, that you start to doubt yourself and think, maybe I really am, you know, crazy. Maybe there isn't anybody. Maybe it's just the thoughts in my head.
And I think I've told you this before. In the moment of crisis, I'm great. A day later, I fall apart.
Revert back to what is some of the things, the suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
The closer he got to being released, the more intense the feelings were, the more concerned and scared we became. I had hired a friend of mine, an electrician, who put up surveillance cameras on the house. We had a central monitor in the bedroom that ran 24 hours a day so we could view the house. We had bought a German Shepherd, well, eventually two, Lucy and Macy. They were good dogs, good protection.
As time wore on, Chris did tell people that she thought that they were going to kill her.
I was in my office and I received a call from Christine, and one of the things she asked me is, should she buy a gun? You need to be trained with one. You got to be comfortable with a gun. You know, without those two things, a gun, a handgun, can be a recipe for disaster for anybody.
He goes to the worst place imaginable, his parents' home in Ed Couch, Texas, where he and they are reunited in their campaign, in their quest.
There were very short periods of time that they were calm, but we were on red alert at that point.
Chris approached me about obtaining her concealed carry so that she could carry a handgun. My primary concern was for the children. A gun? Do you need to have a gun? You've got young children. Why don't you buy pepper spray, put it all over the house, and we'll take some self-defense classes. Because a gun is very, it's very final if should a horrible accident happen.
When we knew David was getting ready to get out of jail, my mom was getting super anxious. I just noticed that she always wanted us in the house, or if we were out, she wanted to know exactly where we were, who we were with.
My worst scenario was probably going to be a murder-suicide. They would come into the home and kill Christine, kill me, and abduct the children again. David refused to pay anything. She went through the proper authorities and the court systems, and there's a hearing. A simple child support hearing. That's all it was intended to be. I asked her, "Do you want me to go to court with you, Chris? I'll go. I'll take the day off work." She was content with no, that I'll go with Beth, my friend.
February 11th was a cold, drizzly, dreary day here in Wilmington, Delaware. David Matuszewicz and his father, Thomas Matuszewicz, drove into Wilmington, Delaware from a friend's house in Maryland.
Knowing that the Matuszewiczes were here in Delaware, close to us, scared me. I actually didn't want to be at the house by myself. I went to my grandmother's house for the day.
Chris was fearful about them being in town and didn't want to have anything to do with it, but kind of resigned to the fact that this was another step in the process. She had to go to court and she had to face him.
When Christine Belford arrived that morning at the courthouse in Newcastle County, she came with Beth Mulford, who was there to give her moral support for that day because she knew how awful everything had been for Christine.
The morning of February 11th started out like just normal every other day. We get prepared. We're all up here at the lobby area of the courthouse, getting ready to screen people in. I remember it was a little busier in the lobby where people waited because of the rain.
I was on my way to work. It was raining and cloudy. About 8:15, I get a call from my captain who tells me there's been a shooting at the Newcastle County Courthouse.
J5. Negative J5. I'm in the courthouse in the Wilmington Courthouse. We got shots fired here.
I heard explosion 1, 2, what I thought was an explosion. And then on the third one, I was on the ground. And then I looked up and I saw a gentleman pointing a gun at me.
I don't know what the status is yet.
10-4, we have several units en route.
When I arrived, the streets in the city of Wilmington were in total gridlock because they had closed off everything in I think a 2-block radius around the courthouse.
In the Wilmington Courthouse, we got shots fired here.
When I first entered the courthouse, the first thing that hit me was the smell of burnt gunpowder. Mass chaos. Police officers everywhere. A couple things that really stuck out with the amount of shell casings on the floor and the shattered glass on the rotating door. There was glass everywhere. It looked like a shootout, is what it looked like. At that point, there were all kinds of captains from various jurisdictions, the state police, the city of Wilmington police, I mean, high-ranking officers. They immediately sent me downstairs in the lobby to go review the surveillance video of the shooting. Basically, I saw a gentleman step out from behind a pole in the lobby area. His intent was very obvious. He stepped up and just shot. There was no discussion, there was nothing. It was just, there's my target, and that's what I'm gonna shoot.
This all happened within 5 to 6 minutes, maybe. And that's when I realized that I had some kind of liquid, something feeling coming down my ribs. I reached in and saw it was blood, and I realized I was shot.
My whole family, not my life flashed before my eyes, but my family flashed before my eyes.
I was at my grandmother's house. The news was on, and they started broadcasting that there had been a shooting at the Wilmington courthouse. I just knew that the Matusowitzes didn't like my mom. I knew that they were gonna be there. I knew that she was gonna be there, and you just have a feeling.
We keep getting questions on the identification of the victims and the suspect. They'll be released pending the proper notification to the next of kin.
I guess it gave me hope that maybe like, okay, she's been shot, but she's fine, like she's gonna be okay. So I just thought, okay, this is like another thing, she'll be home.
I was at work that day. My phone rang twice, and it was someone from Christiana Hospital saying that, are you Gerald Purcell? Do you know Christine? I'm like, what's going on? How is she? And he told me that she had died. It's mind-blowing. It changes you. Makes you appreciate life. To appreciate people. To never take things for granted. It felt like a huge part of my heart was gone.
It doesn't set in right away. It's hard to describe. You're just so sad.
Katie was crying. She said, they did it. They did it. They killed my mommy. They killed my mommy. That's all I really remember is her crying that she didn't know where her sisters were. And they killed my mommy. And I was crying as well. I just kept saying, I'm so sorry, Katie. I'm so sorry.
First and foremost, our hearts and prayers go out to the victims in the shootings. This was the result of a custody dispute that has lasted in our court system for several years.
When I gained composure, I asked him, did David kill her? And he had said, no, it wasn't David.
Christine Belford and Beth Mulford came to the Newcastle County Courthouse and walked through this door. On the other side was Thomas Matusowitz. And as Christine Belford came through the revolving door first and passed just a few feet out into the lobby, Thomas Matusowitz stepped out from his hiding place, raised his right arm, and fired his .45 caliber handgun multiple times into her chest.
Tom was an avid gun collector. He made his own bullets. I could picture him pressing a bullet and saying, this one's for you, Christine, and whoever's coming to that courthouse that day.
It was heartbreaking. Like, I had no idea why she was even in the courthouse. Christine and I had kept in contact every couple of months. I would guarantee you I would have walked her in that courthouse, you know, and I probably would have caught a bullet at that point.
I could see a woman running towards my direction, and there was a male chasing her, and he had a handgun, and I witnessed him shooting her. And for a minute there, it set me back. It was a surreal, feeling. It was like, am I really seeing this, or is this really happening?
At that moment, the lobby of the Newcastle County Courthouse erupted into a complete gun battle as Capitol Police fired back at Thomas Matuszewicz. It was there Thomas Matuszewicz took his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head.
Thomas wrote to a judge in 2010 saying he would give his life for his grandkids, and so he did. They no longer have a pop-pop. They no longer have a mother.
While talking to one of my buddies, I said, I know all about this case, and we got to find this guy, David Matuszewicz. My friend, he said, David Matuszewicz, I just talked to him. They just released him.
Detective Schreiner asked the question that was most critical. Where's David? Securing him became the top priority, because shooting Christine in the courthouse was not the end of their plan.
What I can tell you is I can confirm a shooting that occurred in the lobby of the county courthouse this morning at approximately 8 o'clock. We're processing the entire scene. We have tactical teams searching every floor of that courthouse. There are 12 floors. We're going floor to floor, room by room.
I went over to the escalator, which leads downstairs to the back door. I looked over and saw David, and I yelled to him, David. And he turned around, and I motioned for him to come upstairs. So he walked back up the stairs through the other people, and he was then taken into custody.
I then looked at David and I said, I need to give you some information. The whole time he was just looking down at the floor. I said to him, you probably know your father is deceased. No reaction, none. No eye contact, no sounds. A good 15, 20 seconds went by, a slight exhale, and then he simply said, okay.
Human life meant nothing to these people at that point. It was all about themselves, about these children, and they didn't care what they had to do. I mean, they would have shot me, they'd have shot you, if they thought that was going to get those children back to the Matuszewicz family. They had no regard for human life.
Once I got over the shock of losing Christine, my next reaction was, oh my God, what is going to happen to the children? They can't go back to mom, they can't go back to dad and the family. So what is to become of them?
Although David was our greatest immediate concern, Lenore and Amy posed threats in and of themselves because we knew they were working with other people. We knew others were involved in their efforts to find the kids. There's literally a race to their schools with state troopers to put them in the backs of a car and drive them away. They never see their classmates again. They never see their teachers or their schools again at that moment. That part of their lives is over.
I did get to go to the police station. I got to go into a room where my sisters were and just kind of talk to them a little bit. I didn't know that that would be the last time that I would see them. The day that my mom died, I lost my sisters as well, and I think it's so sad for me because I had lost them once before, And then when we found them from being kidnapped, I thought that this was gonna be like our new normal again and that I wouldn't lose them again. And I think it's hard for me to know that my daughter won't get to grow up with her aunts in her life.
Christine used to call them little minions because they were constant, a constant joy, and I was sad that I couldn't gather them up.
I pushed aside every other case I was working at the time. My partner and I worked this case full time. There was enormous pressure to uncover all the facts and push them into a coherent indictment so that we could lay out to the court that, you know, not only David, but Lenore and Amy as well were guilty.
David's demeanor was extremely subdued. He was very cooperative initially. He was interviewed for about 15 minutes before he asked for an attorney. And during that time, we were able to gain some very valuable information. Based on the level of violence that Tom exhibited, it was believable that that car could have been a trap for law enforcement. So we used our bomb squad to clear the vehicle before we were able to actually see the evidence that was contained in that car.
So I thought I'd go through a couple items of evidence that showed what the family brought with them from Texas, from the CRV, which was directly across the street from the courthouse. You have a set of binoculars. You also have different size sets of handcuffs.
They said that they had child-size restraints, and I just can't imagine what they were thinking or planning to do. Those were still David's kids, so I guess those thoughts still run through my head.
A cattle prod, driven all the way from Texas. For what reason? You also have, again, found in the car. It's over a foot. So it is a rather large knife. You have to ask the question, why would you drive that many miles from southern Texas to Delaware with these items? This family had a mission.
We located Lenore Matuzowicz at that residence. I requested the U.S. Marshals to go there to try to find her. I was actually on the phone with her when they arrived.
We didn't know what her role was in the aftermath of the shooting, but we quickly came to believe that she was a prominent figure in this story.
She was interviewed by some FBI agents. She claimed to have no knowledge of what was going on in Delaware.
There may be no greater example that this was not over when Christine died than what Amy does in the days after the killing. She files a petition for custody of the children because their only parent is now dead. Their only legal parent is now dead. And she's sending a petition to a courthouse that hasn't even been reopened yet after the killing.
I just couldn't believe that after everything they had done, that she thought that the courts were going to just hand them the girls.
Amy's custody petitions were denied by the family court, and she was never awarded custody of the girls. It really shows you that even with Tom dead, with David in jail, and with Christine gone, their goal remained the same. There was only one way to stop them, and that was to put them away forever.
In the fallout of the shooting, we didn't know what charge would apply to David Matuzowicz. We began to look at the terms of David's probation. We put a case forward that he was aware that his father, at an absolute minimum, had firearms on him, and that was a violation of the terms of his federal probation.
And we asked the court to impose a 9-month sentence. The judge gave us 6.
And we thought if David had the chance to get out, the first thing that he would do was go after the children. We raced from the time that we had put David in jail after the shooting until the time that his probation violation was set to expire. We raced in that interim time to figure out as best we could what the potential charges could be, how we could bring those charges, and how we could keep him locked up to protect the children.
So I want to welcome Lenore Matuzowicz.
After the shooting, Lenore does a series of radio interviews with Crusade Radio, which are published on YouTube.
And then she said, I have to do things to mommy. It's a big secret. If I ever tell mommy's going to be in trouble, I don't want my mommy to go to jail. What would you think she meant? I didn't think it was anything good.
She quickly goes in to just the litany of falsehoods and grievances that she says are at the root of what happened.
Christine offhandedly said, when I sell David's 3 blonde white American girls, I'm going to get $50,000 each, and they'll never be found.
It was jarring to see this elderly woman in this short period of time after her husband has been killed, her daughter-in-law is dead, the children are now gone to somewhere she has no idea where.
Christine stated in no uncertain terms, I'm going to take David's business away. I'm going to take his children, his money, and by the time I get finished with him, he'll be in prison and never get out.
And what comes through is not sadness or, regret. What comes through is pure vitriol, anger, hatred, righteous indignation for what's happened.
Every door you opened, every car you looked in, every place you turned throughout this entire investigation, you found something that would just shock you even more. This one's really concerning, and it reads, Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to hide the bodies of those people I had to kill because they pissed me off. I found that really disturbing. Also in Texas, there was a handwritten document, what we believe is Thomas Matuzowicz's handwriting. It indicates he knew he was never coming back to that house. All my guns, take them, protect them. They will be your only protection in the years to come under what was once my government. When court takes your grandchildren away, it ceases then to be your government. It was clear they were prepared for some type of huge battle with someone.
The Matusowiczes were involved in a movement called the Sovereign Citizens Movement. It's an anti-government movement within the United States that does not acknowledge the authority or the jurisdiction of the United States government. They're often individuals who arm themselves very heavily. They're often preparing for some sort of revolt or rebellion against the US government. And it really sort of added fuel to the fire when it came to thinking about how the government had wronged them and favored Christine.
This family had a mission, and their mission was well documented. Red notebook that has pages and pages of information, phone numbers, addresses of individuals. Here at the very top it says HL. It has been referred to as the hit list. The two letters below it is WB.
The nickname they gave to Christine Belford. And just below her name was Tim Hitt. Timothy Hitchens was Christine's family court lawyer.
Obviously, I was intended to be killed that day. It doesn't surprise me, given the extremes that the Matusowiczes went to, that they would want to kill me as well, because I was instrumental in having David's parental rights terminated.
I felt disoriented. I felt threatened as well, because at that time we didn't know who was involved and who might still be at large looking for me.
The best witnesses in the world now are not human beings. They're devices. And they're everywhere. And they're watching. And they're listening. The digital crumbs that we had in the investigation led us all the way back to 2009, when David was in federal prison for the international kidnapping.
As soon as he got to federal prison, he was the one orchestrating everything from his prison cell in federal prison. The first letter that he sent to his family, he told them he was done playing Mr. Nice Guy, and that they were to begin to unleash these baseless false allegations of sexual abuse against Christine Belford. The first phase of the campaign was the establishment of the Grandmother's Impossible Choice website.
So what happens is that Lenore has a notepad in a prison cell, and she begins to write the content that would go into this website. Lenore's sister-in-law assists with Amy in actually creating the website and posting it onto the internet. They don't hide their digital tracks, so the website is very easily traced right to them, which is an important fact for us in the case, because we're able to show that they are in fact using the internet to engage in this harassment campaign. We were able to trace the posting of the Mommy Don't Hurt Me YouTube videos back to the hospital that Amy worked at. We ended up finding the particular coworker who posted it for Amy, because she wasn't technologically savvy enough actually to get it posted onto YouTube.
We began to conduct search warrants on various email accounts associated with David, Lenore, Amy, and we began to uncover and paint a picture of stalking. And the stalking was done primarily through the internet. The very first key piece of evidence that led us on our way to what ultimately became the first cyber stalking case resulting in murder came from an email, a piece of paper email that we found in one of the vehicles used by the Matusewicz family to drive up to Delaware.
I thought Cindy was somebody who was a good friend of my mom. I did like that she was so interested in the girls, and she seemed to really care about everybody.
Christine was trying to protect her profile on Facebook and had it set to private. So as a Facebook friend of Christine's, Cindy was able to see information that the general public would not be able to see.
In reality, Cindy Bender was a spy for the Matusewicz family, and all the information that she was able to gather about Christine's children was conveyed back to the Matusewicz family and used by the Matusewicz family to destroy, harass, terrorize Christine and her children.
I just don't know what she was thinking and why she would do that to my mom after everything that we've been through.
When we began to look into Cindy Bender, we uncovered that she had a long connection to the Matusewicz family.
Cindy Bender was someone who was really just in love with David. And even though he was in federal prison, she and he began communicating. She became very emotionally involved with him. She saw that giving him information about Christine was a way to win affection and favor from him.
It disgusts me. I just cannot even imagine how some woman could put another woman through that. It's the lowest of the low.
David was good at getting people to do what he wanted. So if it wasn't her, it just would have been another.
The Matusewicz family preyed upon this idea that Christine Belford was actively, in an ongoing way, sexually and physically abusing her children. And so they used that to get people to help them. They used a real estate agent in Delaware to get information that was not available to the public about Christine Belford's house. So now they have all of the pictures of the inside of the house. They know exactly where the children are sleeping. They know exactly where Christine Belford's staying.
And here are the physical pictures. These are originals. Entryway to the neighborhood off of Route 72. They have a picture of the rear of the house, and they mark it rear. Here is a walking path that they actually write on there that there's a walking path. So they're doing their operational planning as to how would you approach the house.
They used friends to drive by Christine Belford's house to figure out who was staying there, get license plates for them. They tried to figure out who the cars belonged to. What threat would they pose if Thomas and David, when he was ultimately released, were to conduct a home invasion on the house?
My mom always told me that if something was to happen and the Matusewitzes were to come to the house, that she was going to try and hold them off downstairs, and she wanted us to get a rope ladder, and she wanted me to help my sisters get out of the second floor window so that they could go next door. I think that when we realized the amount of ammo and guns that they did have with them, that my mom was smart for trying to prepare for something like that.
So after 6 months of work, gathering all of these facts, compiling them into legal charges that we could present to the grand jury, we raced the clock until the very end.
We brought our indictment to the grand jury the day before David Matuzowicz was supposed to be released from custody. That's how close to the wire it came. Someone, at least at this point, needed to fight for Christine, needed to fight for the children, who we thought very clearly were still in real and present danger if we didn't win the case.
David displayed zero emotion whatsoever. And that was clear to the jury never more than when 13-year-old Laura Matuzowicz testified.
The trial was challenging, of course, because we were bringing what was at the time a novel charge. The charge, cyber stalking resulting in death, had never been brought before in the history of the United States.
She has no comment.
No comments.
Why?
So we ended up admitting into evidence over 600 exhibits in the case, which is a lot for a federal trial. It's very much a matter of the jury understanding the digital trail and crumbs that the defendants left that we can piece together.
We argued to the jury that the family operated almost in a cult-like fashion. David was clearly the organizer, the leader of this movement.
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that David pulled all the strings. He was a master manipulator of people. I think that he manipulated everyone in the family.
Amy Gonzalez was like a communications hub. She was the most savvy, being the youngest one of them all, with the internet, with the mail. Lenore, his mother, was almost like the spiritual person who was constantly giving support to this desire to really crush Christine Belford. And then, of course, Thomas Matuzowicz, he was the shooter. He was the guy at the end of the life that was willing to sacrifice it all for this ridiculous cultish cause. The piece of evidence that was critically important was hearing from Christine herself. We had audio tapes of Christine's therapy sessions, and she, from the grave, got to tell the jury exactly what she was feeling.
I love this children, and I have been through so much, and they have been through so much. They need me, and sometimes that overwhelms me.
I think my mom had to fight for my sisters continuously and be strong for them because she wanted them to have the life that they deserve to live. She was stronger than a lot of people I know. She was dealing with all of this and making it seem like everything was great.
At trial, the Matuzowicz's defense was really that they had done nothing wrong. They were simply trying to protect the girls from their abusive mother. Laura found out about the YouTube videos when she Googled herself for the first time in the summer between her 3rd and 4th grade years. It was the first thing she learned about what the internet thought of her. Think about how terrible that is. And what was most powerful, I think, was that this family had for 6 years, claimed We just need to get Laura to tell her story. So Laura needed to come in. She needed to look at that jury, really from just a few feet away in the courtroom, and explain to them that this was all a lie, that her mother didn't do these things to her. The Metuzowicz stood silent, and the lies fell apart right in front of the jury.
No, we're going through that.
Today, we just saw a cyber stalking resulting in death, the first conviction of its kind in the United States. It's a victory for 3 young girls and Christine. We stand before you with a just verdict.
This case represented an escalation of conduct that absolutely suffocated Christine Belford, and she fought back. This trial represented an extension of Christine Belford's fight. It represented the bravery and courage of her children who came into this courtroom and testified on her behalf. It represented the very best, I think, of law enforcement and what our system of justice can do in situations of domestic violence.
And many of the things that we saw happen in the Metuzowicz case, we now see as being very commonplace in our society. Disinformation, trying to ruin people's reputations online, lying and promoting lies in an effort to advance agendas. We see very much a fight for the soul of the internet, and I think that's going to continue.
The case has had a big impact.
Night falls differently in the quiet neighborhoods of Central Florida. The air is thick, heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to skin and slows the world down. Street lights glow dimly against rows of modest houses. Porch swings creak. Crickets scream in the darkness. On nights like that, nothing is supposed to happen. Nothing ever does. And yet, on one ordinary evening in the summer of 2001, something did. Something that would shatter a family, haunt an entire town, and quietly slip into the long, cold archive of unsolved mysteries. Her name was Emily Carter, 17 years old, a senior at a small high school just outside Orlando, the kind of girl teachers described as bright and neighbors described as polite. She worked weekends at a local ice cream shop, drove an aging silver Honda Civic, and spent most evenings talking on the phone with friends about college applications and prom dresses. Nothing about her life suggested danger. Nothing suggested the story that was about to unfold. On June 14th, Emily left her house just after 8:15 p.m. Her mother remembered the moment clearly. Emily standing in the doorway, keys in hand, phone tucked in her pocket. She said she was meeting a friend. Just a quick trip out. She'd be back before midnight. It was the last time anyone in her family would ever see her. At 10:47 p.m., a cashier at a gas station 2 miles from Emily's house remembered seeing a teenage girl who matched her description. Security footage later confirmed it. Emily walking inside, buying a bottle of water and a pack of gum. She looked calm, relaxed. She even smiled briefly at the camera as she stepped back outside. Then the trail went cold. Her car was found the next morning, parked crookedly along the edge of a narrow road that cut through a stretch of thick pine forest just outside town. The engine was off. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse sat on the passenger seat. Phone gone. Emily gone. No signs of a struggle. No broken glass. No witnesses. The discovery triggered a wave of panic across the community. Patrol cars flooded the area. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers combed through dense brush and swampy terrain under the brutal Florida sun. Search dogs tracked scent trails that vanished abruptly near the roadside. Within hours, the phrase began circulating quietly among investigators. Missing teen. Possible abduction. Local news stations picked up the story by afternoon. Her photograph appeared across television screens. Brown hair, bright eyes, the hesitant smile of a girl on the edge of adulthood. The words underneath were simple but chilling. Teen disappears under mysterious circumstances. Detectives from the county sheriff's office established a timeline almost immediately. Emily leaves home at 8:15. Gas station sighting at 10:47. Car discovered around 6:30 the next morning. Everything that mattered had happened somewhere between those hours. Somewhere in the darkness, along that empty Florida road. Investigators began knocking on doors. Neighbors, friends, classmates, anyone who might have seen something, heard something, noticed something out of place. Most had nothing, but a few details began to surface. Small ones, strange ones. One neighbor reported hearing what sounded like a car door slam around 11:30 that night. Another mentioned seeing headlights briefly stopped along the forest road before disappearing into the trees. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it painted a picture that made detectives uneasy. Emily Carter had not simply vanished. Something had happened out there. Inside the Carter home, time had frozen. Her mother sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring, waiting for Emily to walk through the door with an explanation. A misunderstanding, a story that would make everything make sense. Morning came. Emily never did. By the third day, the search area expanded. Dive teams examined nearby lakes and retention ponds. Mounted units pushed deeper into swampy woodland. Volunteers formed human chains across fields of tall grass. Still nothing. The forest kept its silence. Detectives turned their focus toward the people closest to Emily. Friends first. One name came up repeatedly. Jason Miller, 19 years old, former student at the same high school. Someone Emily had known casually for years. Not quite a boyfriend, not quite a stranger. Witnesses said the two had spoken recently. Text messages confirmed it. Jason told investigators he had planned to meet Emily that night, but claimed she never showed up. He said he waited at a diner for nearly an hour before going home. His story sounded reasonable, at least at first, but detectives noticed something else. Jason's timeline left gaps. Small ones. 30 minutes here, 40 minutes there. Periods where he couldn't clearly remember where he'd been or what he'd done. When pressed, he shrugged. I was driving around. Driving where? Just around. It wasn't enough to charge him. Not even close. But it was enough to make investigators write his name at the top of their board. Days turned into weeks. Tips poured in from across the state. Most led nowhere. A few sparked brief moments of hope before collapsing under scrutiny. A truck driver claimed he'd seen a frightened teenage girl near a rest stop 2 counties away. False alarm. A fisherman reported finding a shoe along a riverbank that resembled the ones Emily wore. Wrong size. Each lead faded into the same frustrating conclusion. No evidence. No body. No answers. By late July, the case had already begun to cool. National media moved on to other stories. Bigger stories. Louder ones. But in the small Florida town where Emily Carter had lived, the disappearance never faded. Her photograph hung in grocery stores. Flyers covered telephone poles. The Carter family kept the porch light on every night. Months passed. Then a year. The sheriff's office eventually reclassified the investigation with 2 quiet words investigators dread more than almost anything. Cold case. Boxes of reports. Interview transcripts. Evidence logs. Photographs. All carefully archived in a storage room filled with other unsolved mysteries. Emily Carter's file was thick, but it was also empty of the one thing that mattered most. Proof. Jason Miller remained on investigators' radar for years. Detectives interviewed him multiple times, each conversation circling the same unanswered questions. Where had he been that night? Why had Emily driven toward that forest road? Why had her phone never been found? Jason's answers never changed. He denied everything. And without evidence, the law had no choice but to leave him alone. Time kept moving. The town changed. New families moved in. Old businesses closed. Students graduated from the same high school Emily had once attended, many of them barely aware of the mystery that still lingered beneath the surface of their quiet community. But some people never forgot, especially the detectives. Cold cases have a way of living inside the minds of investigators long after the headlines disappear. They linger like unfinished sentences, unanswered questions echoing in quiet offices late at night. One detective in particular refused to let the Carter file disappear. Detective Alan Reyes. He joined the sheriff's office years after Emily vanished. By then, the case was already gathering dust. Most officers assumed it would stay that way forever. Reyes thought otherwise. There was something about the timeline that bothered him, something about the silence surrounding that forest road. He spent nights reading through interview transcripts, studying witness statements, replaying the same narrow window of time over and over. June 14th, 8:15 p.m., 10:47 p.m., 11:30 p.m. A missing girl, an abandoned car, a suspect who had never quite convinced anyone. Reyes believed the truth was still there, hidden somewhere inside thousands of forgotten pages. And one day, nearly 20 years after Emily Carter stepped out of her front door for the last time, a single detail buried deep inside that cold case file would surface again. A detail so small it had barely registered the first time investigators saw it. But once noticed, it would change everything. Because the story of Emily Carter was not over. Not even close. Some cold cases fade quietly into history. This one was waiting for someone to finally see what had been hiding in plain sight all along. The Carter file had been sitting in the sheriff's evidence archive for nearly 2 decades, buried among hundreds of other unresolved investigations, each box marked with faded ink and the quiet weight of unfinished stories. Dust clung to the cardboard edges, old evidence tags curled with age. For most people inside the department, the disappearance of Emily Carter had long ago settled into the category detectives rarely spoke about out loud, the cases that never quite die, but never move forward either. The ones that wait. Detective Alan Reyes didn't believe in waiting. He first opened the Carter file on a humid evening in late August, long after most of the building had emptied out. Fluorescent lights hummed above his desk. Outside, thunder rolled slowly across the Florida sky, the kind of summer storm that creeps in without warning and blankets the town in heavy rain. The folder was thicker than he expected. Interview transcripts, evidence inventories, old photographs, maps of a search grid drawn with red marker, newspaper clippings, yellowed with time. Each page told part of a story that had stalled somewhere between suspicion and proof. Reyes started at the beginning. June 14th, 2001. Emily Carter leaves home at 8:15 p.m. Seen at the gas station at 10:47 p.m. Carr discovered the next morning. He read every report slowly, absorbing details other investigators might have skimmed years earlier. The quiet habits of a girl who had simply stepped out for the night. The panic that followed. The interviews with friends who remembered ordinary conversations that suddenly felt important after she disappeared. What struck him most wasn't what the file contained. It was what it didn't. No confirmed sightings after the gas station. No physical evidence tying any suspect to the car. No fingerprints besides Emily's, and a few partial smudges too incomplete to identify. The case had stalled because it had nowhere left to go. Except one place. Jason Miller. Reyes flipped to the section marked with his name. Even after 20 years, the pattern stood out immediately. Jason appeared in interview after interview, always hovering just outside the circle of certainty investigators needed to charge him. Detectives had spoken with him 5 separate times during the original investigation. Each time the same basic story emerged. He had planned to meet Emily that night. She never showed. He waited at the diner. Then he drove around for a while before going home. Simple, calm, almost rehearsed. But the more Reyes read, the more something about those statements began to bother him. Jason's timeline had always contained empty spaces, not large enough to prove anything. Just small pockets of uncertainty where his memory seemed strangely vague. Where exactly had he driven after leaving the diner? He couldn't remember. Which roads? Not sure. Did he pass the forest road where Emily's car was eventually found? He didn't think so. That answer had always irritated earlier investigators, but without evidence, irritation wasn't enough. Reyes leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Outside, rain began to fall harder against the windows. Cold cases rarely solve themselves. They require something unusual, new technology, new witnesses, or a mistake someone made years earlier that suddenly becomes visible. Reyes began searching for the mistake. He moved through the file again, slower this time, pausing at photographs taken during the first days of the investigation. Emily's abandoned car sat half on the gravel shoulder, tilted slightly toward a shallow ditch. Tall pine trees crowded both sides of the road, their branches forming a dark canopy that blocked most of the moonlight that night. One photograph showed the interior of the vehicle. Purse on the passenger seat, water bottle in the cup holder, keys missing. Another image captured the road itself stretching into darkness, empty and quiet. Reyes noticed something scribbled in the corner of the evidence log attached to the photograph. 3 words written by a patrol officer who had arrived early that morning. Fresh tire tracks. Reyes frowned. He flipped through the rest of the file looking for references to those tracks. There were a few mentions in early reports. Investigators had documented tire impressions near the roadside, but heavy rain that afternoon had quickly destroyed most of the usable patterns. No match had ever been made. Still, it meant something important. Another vehicle had likely been there, possibly at the same time Emily was. Reyes kept reading. The next detail appeared buried in a witness statement taken 3 days after the disappearance. A woman who lived about half a mile from the forest road reported seeing headlights late that night. She described 2 vehicles parked along the roadside for several minutes before one of them drove away quickly. At the time, investigators couldn't confirm the sighting. Now, 20 years later, it carried a different weight. 2 vehicles, Emily's car and someone else's. Reyes circled the line with a pen. If Emily had met someone out there, the obvious question followed immediately. Why? The original investigation had assumed she was heading to meet Jason Miller somewhere else that evening. But the timeline didn't quite support that theory. The gas station sighting happened at 10:47. The diner where Jason claimed he waited closed at 11. That left very little time. Unless the meeting place had changed. Reyes flipped back to the interview transcripts with Emily's friends. One statement caught his attention. A classmate named Laura Bennett mentioned that Emily had received several phone calls earlier that evening, including one that seemed to upset her. According to Laura, Emily had stepped outside during a small gathering at her house to take the call. When she came back inside, she looked distracted. Nervous. Laura asked who it was. Emily didn't say. At the time, investigators tried to retrieve Emily's phone records. But cell phone technology in 2001 wasn't what it is today. Data retention was limited. Many records were already gone by the time subpoenas were issued. Another lead that dissolved into nothing. Reyes rubbed his eyes and checked the clock. Nearly midnight. Most detectives would have closed the file and gone home. Instead, he opened another section labeled Evidence Collected. Inside were photographs of items recovered from Emily's car, receipts, a notebook from school, a folded map of the local area. Reyes studied the map carefully. One location had been circled with blue pen, the same forest road where the car had been found. But something about the circle looked different. It wasn't drawn by investigators. The handwriting was too thin, too careful. It looked like Emily's. Reyes sat forward. Why would Emily circle that road on her map? Had she planned to go there? Or had someone told her to? The possibility lingered in the quiet office like a whisper. If Emily had arranged to meet someone along that road, it would explain several things at once. Why she drove there voluntarily. Why there were no signs of a struggle inside the car. Why 2 sets of headlights were seen that night. Reyes flipped back to Jason Miller's statements again. Each time detectives had asked whether he knew anything about that road, Jason answered the same way. No, he had never been there. Reyes stared at the page for a long moment. Then he reached for another document. Jason's original vehicle registration from 2001. A dark green pickup truck. Reyes wrote something on his notepad. Tire tracks. Then another line. Forest Road meeting. And finally, one question he couldn't stop thinking about. If Jason didn't meet her, who did? The rain outside had stopped. Silence filled the building. Reyes closed the Carter file slowly. Cold cases often hinge on tiny moments overlooked during the chaos of the original investigation. A word spoken casually. A detail written down but never followed. He had a feeling he had just found one. But the real breakthrough wouldn't come from the past. It would come from the future. Because somewhere out there, someone had been living with the truth about what happened on that dark Florida road in 2001. And people who carry secrets for that long almost always make one mistake eventually. They talk. And when they do, the silence of a cold case can shatter in an instant. 20 years is a long time for a secret to survive. People move away. Relationships fall apart, memories fade, and the fear that once kept mouths shut slowly begins to erode. Detectives who work cold cases understand this better than anyone. Time can bury evidence, but it also weakens the walls people build around the truth. Detective Alan Reyes knew that if the Emily Carter case was ever going to move again, it would likely start with a voice, someone remembering something they hadn't been ready to say in 2001. So he began where many cold case investigators do. He reopened the past. Over the next several weeks, Reyes tracked down people connected to the original investigation. Some had left Florida years ago. Others still lived quietly in the same neighborhoods, their lives moving forward while the mystery of Emily Carter remained frozen in time. The reactions were always similar. Shocked that the case was being reopened. A pause. Then the same sentence. I wish I knew something that could help. Most didn't. But Reyes wasn't expecting a dramatic confession or a hidden witness waiting to reveal everything. Cold cases rarely work that way. They move inch by inch, detail by detail, until one piece finally refuses to fit the old narrative anymore. The first meaningful crack appeared during a conversation with Laura Bennett, the same Laura who, 2 decades earlier, had mentioned the strange phone call Emily received the night she vanished. Reyes met her at a small cafe near the edge of town on a gray afternoon. She was 36 now, a mother of 2, her life full of responsibilities that had nothing to do with the frightened teenager she once was. At first, her memories came slowly. The gathering at her house that night, a few friends sitting in the living room, Emily stepping outside to take a call. Laura stared at her coffee for a long moment. Then she said something that made Reyes' pen stop moving. I didn't mention this back then, she said quietly. Or maybe I did, I can't remember. Everything was so chaotic after she disappeared. Reyes waited. Laura looked uneasy. When Emily came back inside after that call, she asked me something strange. What was it? Reyes asked. Laura hesitated. She asked if I'd ever been out to that old logging road near Pine Ridge. Reyes felt a subtle tightening in his chest. Pine Ridge, the same forest road where Emily's car had been found. What did you tell her? He asked. Laura shook her head, slightly. I told her no. Nobody went out there. It was creepy. Just woods and dirt roads. Did she say why she was asking? Laura's expression shifted, as if she were replaying the moment in her mind. She just said she might be meeting someone there. The cafe suddenly felt quieter. Reyes leaned forward. Did she say who? Laura's answer came almost immediately. No. That silence spoke louder than anything else. Because it meant something important. Emily Carter had not ended up on that forest road by accident. She had planned to go there, which raised a far darker possibility. Someone had asked her to come. Reyes drove back to the sheriff's office with the old case file open on the passenger seat beside him. The Florida sky was fading into evening again, shadows stretching across the same roads Emily had driven 20 years earlier. One question repeated itself in his mind. Who arranged that meeting? He already had a likely answer. Jason Miller. But suspicion wasn't evidence. And after 2 decades, the difference mattered more than ever. Reyes spent the next several days digging deeper into Jason's past. Not just the statements he gave in 2001, but everything that had happened since. Where he had lived, who he had known, what kind of life he had built in the years after Emily disappeared. The picture that emerged was surprisingly ordinary. Jason had moved out of town 5 years after the investigation faded from the headlines. He now lived in a small city about 3 hours north, working as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. No criminal record, no arrests, a quiet life. To anyone who didn't know the history, Jason Miller looked like just another man who had grown older and moved on. But Reyes knew something most people didn't. The original detectives had never stopped believing Jason knew more than he admitted. They simply hadn't been able to prove it. Now Reyes needed to find out if that suspicion still held weight, or if 20 years had hidden something else entirely. He requested updated background reports, financial records, employment history, anything that might reveal a pattern. Most of it was unremarkable, until one small detail surfaced. In the spring of 2001, just 3 months before Emily vanished, Jason Miller had purchased a set of new tires for his pickup truck. The purchase itself wasn't unusual, but the brand caught Reyes' attention. a specific off-road model with a distinctive tread pattern. Reyes immediately pulled the old evidence photos from the Carter file. The images of tire tracks near Emily's abandoned car were faded, partially washed out by rain that had arrived later that day. But even through the distortion, the pattern was still faintly visible. Wide grooves, angled edges, the kind commonly found on off-road tires. Reyes placed the two photographs side by side. It wasn't enough for a match. Not even close. But it was enough to raise a troubling possibility. Jason Miller's truck could have been the second vehicle on that forest road. And if it had been there, then Jason's story about waiting at a diner that night would collapse instantly. Still, speculation alone wouldn't reopen a 20-year-old case. Reyes needed something stronger. Something modern investigators had that detectives in 2001 didn't. Technology. He contacted the state forensic lab and requested a re-examination of every piece of physical evidence collected from Emily's car. Fingerprints, fibers, DNA traces that might have been invisible to investigators 2 decades earlier. Cold case units across the country had seen miracles happen this way. Tiny fragments of genetic material, skin cells left behind on a door handle, a strand of hair caught in upholstery, suddenly revealing identities years after crimes were committed. Sometimes the past left fingerprints it didn't know existed. Weeks passed while the evidence was processed. During that time, Reyes drove north, 3 hours along the interstate, until he reached the quiet town where Jason Miller now lived. The auto shop sat beside a gas station on the edge of town, the smell of oil and hot asphalt thick in the afternoon air. Reyes parked across the street and watched. A man in his late 30s stepped out from under the hood of a truck, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He laughed at something another mechanic said, the easy body language of someone who had settled into a routine life. Jason Miller looked nothing like the 19-year-old in the old case file photographs. But Reyes knew something Jason didn't. Cold cases have a way of waking up, and when they do, the past can arrive without warning. Jason had lived 20 years believing the questions about Emily Carter were fading into history. He had no idea a detective 3 hours away was already rebuilding the night that destroyed a girl's life. Back at the forensic lab, technicians worked carefully through the preserved evidence from 2001. Gloved hands opened seal bags. Ultraviolet lights scanned surfaces. Advanced DNA extraction methods probed areas investigators once believed were clean. And then, one quiet afternoon, a technician examining the interior driver's door of Emily Carter's abandoned car noticed something almost invisible. A trace, a smear, skin cells, too small to see with the naked eye, but enough, perhaps, to speak. The sample was carefully collected, cataloged, and sent for DNA profiling. If the genetic material belonged to Emily, it would mean nothing. But if it belonged to someone else, the silence surrounding that dark Florida road in 2001 might finally begin to break. In cold cases, breakthroughs rarely arrive with noise. There are no dramatic alarms, no sudden shouts across the room. Just quiet moments inside laboratories where machines hum softly and technicians stare at screens, watching patterns of data slowly assemble themselves into something meaningful. The DNA sample recovered from the inside of Emily Carter's driver's side door was barely visible when it was collected. A faint smear of skin cells that investigators in 2001 simply didn't have the technology to isolate. Back then, it would have been considered useless. Now, 2 decades later, it was sitting inside a sterile testing tube beneath the bright white lights of the state forensic lab. Technicians began the extraction process carefully, aware that samples this small could disappear with the slightest mistake. Chemical solutions separated the genetic material from the surrounding debris. Microscopic fragments of DNA were amplified through polymerase chain reaction cycles, slowly building enough genetic information for analysis. Hours turned into days. Then numbers started appearing. Markers, sequences, a genetic profile taking shape. When the analysis finished, the lab ran the DNA through the national database, hoping for a match against known offenders already in the system. The screen returned the answer within seconds. No match. For a moment, the room fell quiet. It wasn't unexpected. Many people who leave DNA at crime scenes have never been arrested before, meaning their genetic profile wouldn't exist in the database. But the absence of a match meant investigators would have to compare the sample directly with known individuals connected to the case. And there was one name at the very top of that list: Jason Miller. Back at the sheriff's office, Detective Alan Reyes received the lab report on a warm October afternoon. He read the results slowly. Male DNA profile recovered from the interior driver's door of Emily Carter's vehicle, not belonging to the victim. Origin unknown. Reyes leaned back in his chair. This was the first real piece of physical evidence the case had ever produced. Someone had touched the inside of Emily's driver's side door. Someone other than Emily. And if investigators could prove that someone was Jason Miller, the entire narrative of that night would change. Reyes contacted the district attorney's office immediately. To obtain a direct DNA sample from Jason, they would need either consent or a warrant. Consent was unlikely. Warrants, especially in cold cases, required careful justification. Fortunately, the circumstances were beginning to line up. A suspect who had planned to meet the victim. A vehicle that may have matched tire tracks at the scene. And now unknown male DNA inside the victim's car. It wasn't enough to file charges yet, but it was enough to take the next step. 2 days later, Reyes drove north again. The autumn sun hung low over the highway as he approached the small town where Jason Miller now lived. The same auto repair shop stood beside the road, engines rumbling in the open bays as mechanics worked through the afternoon. Reyes stepped inside. The smell of motor oil and hot metal filled the air. Jason Miller was standing near a lifted pickup truck, tightening bolts beneath the hood. He looked up when the detective approached, wiping his hands with a rag. For a moment, there was confusion in his eyes. Then recognition flickered. It was subtle. Just a small pause. But Reyes noticed it. "Jason Miller?" Reyes asked. Jason nodded slowly. "Yeah." Reyes reached into his jacket and showed his badge. "Detective Alan Reyes, County Sheriff's Office." A quiet tension settled into the space between them. Even after 20 years, the name Emily Carter still carried weight. Jason forced a small smile. "Did something happen?" Reyes studied him carefully. "We're reviewing an old case." Jason's smile faded. Neither man said the name out loud. They didn't need to. Jason leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. "I already talked to detectives about that. A long time ago." "I know," Reyes replied calmly. "But we're taking another look." For several seconds, the only sound in the garage was the distant whir of an air compressor. Jason shrugged. "I told them everything I knew." Reyes nodded. "That's what I'd like to talk about." The two men stepped outside, away from the noise of a shop. A warm breeze moved through the parking lot, carrying the faint smell of gasoline from the station next door. Reyes kept his tone neutral. "Walk me through that night again." Jason sighed, clearly irritated but not surprised. "I already did this." "Humor me." Jason rubbed the back of his neck. "I was supposed to meet Emily at a diner. She never showed. I waited for a while, then I left. And after that, I drove around." "Where?" Jason hesitated. "Just around town." The same vague answer he had given 20 years earlier. Reyes watched his face carefully. "Did you drive near Pine Ridge that night?" Jason shook his head immediately. "No." "You're sure?" "Yeah." Reyes nodded slowly as if accepting the answer. Then he said something that shifted the atmosphere instantly. "We recovered DNA from Emily's car." Jason blinked. For the first time since the conversation began, his composure slipped, just for a fraction of a second. Reyes saw it. Jason looked away toward the road. "That doesn't mean anything," he said quickly. "I knew her. I'd been in her car before." Reyes didn't respond right away. Because that statement mattered. During the original investigation, Jason had told detectives he had never been inside Emily's car. Not once. The silence stretched. Jason realized what he had just done. His jaw tightened. "I mean, maybe once," he muttered. Reyes kept his expression neutral, but inside his thoughts were racing. People lie in predictable ways when they're surprised. They try to repair mistakes quickly, hoping the listener won't notice the shift. But detectives are trained to notice exactly those moments. And Jason Miller had just changed his story. After 20 years, Reyes spoke carefully. "We'd like to eliminate you from the DNA comparison." Jason stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means we'd like a voluntary sample. A cheek swab. Jason didn't answer immediately. Cars passed along the road behind them. The world outside continued moving, unaware that a secret from 2001 might be starting to crack open. Finally, Jason shrugged again. If it helps close the case. Reyes handed him the sterile swab. Jason rubbed it along the inside of his cheek under the detective's watchful eye. The sample was sealed, tagged, evidence. As Reyes returned to his car a few minutes later, he glanced once more toward the garage. Jason Miller stood in the doorway watching him leave. The calm expression was back on his face, but the detective had already seen the moment when that calm broke. Back at the forensic lab, the comparison began. 2 DNA profiles entered the system. One recovered from Emily Carter's driver's side door. The other freshly collected from Jason Miller. The computer analyzed the sequences, marker by marker, gene by gene. There would be only 2 possible outcomes. Either the profiles would not match, forcing investigators back to the beginning of the mystery, or the result would confirm what many detectives had quietly suspected since the summer of 2001. That Jason Miller had been there, inside Emily Carter's car. On the night she disappeared, forensic laboratories operate on patients. The machines do not care about 20-year-old mysteries, grieving families, or detectives who have spent months reopening a case the world had already forgotten. They simply process data, sequence by sequence, comparing patterns that determine whether 2 people share the same genetic signature. Inside the state lab, the comparison between the 2 DNA samples began quietly. One profile, the unknown male, DNA recovered from the inside of Emily Carter's driver's side door. The other, the fresh cheek swab taken from Jason Miller. The technicians loaded the samples into the analysis system and let the software begin its work. Genetic markers appeared across the screen in rows of numbers and letters, tiny biological fingerprints that could identify a person with near absolute certainty. Marker 1, Marker 2, Marker 3. With each match, the probability of coincidence dropped further and further toward 0. Hours later, the final report printed. A technician read the conclusion twice before calling the sheriff's office. The answer was simple. The DNA matched. Jason Miller's genetic profile was identical to the DNA recovered from inside Emily Carter's car. 20 years after her disappearance, the first undeniable physical connection between Jason and the scene had finally emerged. Detective Alan Reyes received the call late in the afternoon. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He simply stared at the report lying on his desk as the lab technician summarized the findings. Full profile match. Statistical probability, 1 in several trillion. In the language of forensic science, it was definitive. Jason Miller had touched the inside of Emily Carter's driver's side door. The problem was that fact alone still didn't prove murder. Defense attorneys loved explanations for DNA. They could argue that Jason had been in the car on another day, that Emily had given him a ride weeks earlier, that the sample had been transferred accidentally. Cold cases demand more than suspicion. They demand context. Reyes opened the original interview transcripts again, flipping quickly to the section from Jason's first police interview in June 2001. One line stood out immediately. Detective, have you ever been inside Emily's car? Jason Miller, no, never. Reyes tapped the page with his finger. That statement, combined with the DNA evidence, changed everything. It meant Jason had lied to investigators from the beginning. And people rarely lie about something that's simple unless they're hiding something far bigger. The next step was inevitable. Jason Miller needed to be interviewed again. This time, the conversation would be very different. 3 days later, Jason sat in a small interview room inside the county sheriff's office. He had agreed to come voluntarily, though the tension in his posture made it clear he knew this meeting wouldn't be easy. The room looked like every other interrogation space in America. A metal table, 2 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner. Detective Reyes sat across from him, a thick folder resting calmly on the table between them. Jason glanced at it nervously. You drove 3 hours to bring me here, he asked. Reyes gave a small nod. This case deserves answers. Jason leaned back in his chair, arms folded. I already told you everything. Reyes opened the folder slowly. Inside were photographs from the crime scene, lab reports, transcripts, and the DNA comparison results. He slid a single page across the table. Jason looked down at it. His eyes scanned the document. The change in his expression was immediate. Confusion first, then recognition. Finally, something else. Fear. "That's your DNA," Reyes said quietly. Jason didn't respond. "You told detectives in 2001 you had never been inside Emily's car." Jason swallowed. "I might have forgotten." "Forgotten?" Jason shifted in his seat. "It was 20 years ago." Reyes leaned forward slightly. "Your DNA was recovered from the inside of her driver's door." Silence filled the room. Jason stared at the table. "You want to explain how it got there?" For nearly 30 seconds, Jason said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded thinner. "I told you we knew each other. Maybe I leaned into the car once or something." Reyes didn't move. "You told investigators you had never been inside." Jason rubbed his hands together. "I didn't think it mattered." "It matters now." Jason's breathing had changed. Slightly faster. Slightly uneven. The detective watched him carefully. Cold case interviews often rely on pressure built slowly over time. Investigators present pieces of evidence step by step, forcing suspects to adapt their story repeatedly until the contradictions become impossible to maintain. Jason was already adjusting his narrative. That meant the pressure was working. Reyes slid another photograph across the table. The image showed Emily Carter's abandoned Honda sitting beside the dark forest road. "This is where her car was found," Reyes said. Jason nodded faintly. "You said you never went out there." "I didn't." Reyes placed a second photograph beside the first. This one showed the tire impressions investigators had photographed in 2001. Witnesses saw 2 vehicles parked there that night. Jason's jaw tightened. "I don't know anything about that." Reyes leaned back slightly. "But we know you were inside her car." Jason said nothing. "And we know she planned to meet someone on that road." Jason's fingers tapped nervously against the metal table. Reyes lowered his voice. "Jason, this is the part where the truth usually starts coming out." Jason looked up sharply. "I told you the truth. Then help me understand something." Reyes opened another document. Laura Bennett's recent statement. She said Emily told her she might be meeting someone on Pine Ridge Road. Jason stared at the wall behind Reyes. The detective watched him carefully. "Did you ask her to meet you there?" "No." "Did she ask you?" "No." "Then why was she there?" Jason shook his head slowly. "I don't know." Reyes studied him for a long moment. Then he said something that changed the tone of the room completely. "We're going to find her, Jason." The words hung in the air. Jason's eyes flickered. Even after 20 years, the possibility of Emily Carter being found somewhere in those Florida woods carried enormous weight. If her remains were discovered, the investigation would transform instantly into a homicide case. And if Jason Miller had been there that night, every second of silence in this room would begin to matter. Jason exhaled slowly. "You're chasing ghosts," he muttered. Reyes didn't respond right away, because he had already seen something in Jason's reaction that told him this interview was only the beginning. People can hide secrets for years, sometimes decades, but when evidence starts to surface, those secrets begin to press against the walls of silence. Cracks appear, stories change, and eventually, someone says something they cannot take back. Jason Miller had already changed his story once. The question now was how many more times it would change before the truth about that night in 2001 finally emerged. The walls are plain. The lights are bright. The space feels smaller the longer someone sits inside it. Hours stretch in ways that make even the most confident people begin to second-guess their own memories. Detectives know this. They rely on it, because the longer a suspect talks, the harder it becomes to keep a story perfectly straight. Jason Miller had already adjusted his story once. That alone was significant. 20 years earlier, he had told investigators he had never been inside Emily Carter's car. Now, faced with DNA evidence, he had shifted to a different explanation. Maybe he had leaned inside once. Maybe he had forgotten. But the problem with small lies is that they create bigger ones. And Detective Alan Reyes knew exactly where to press next. Jason sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clasped together on the metal table as if trying to hold something steady inside himself. The air conditioning hummed softly above them. Reyes flipped another page in the folder. "Let's talk about the diner," he said. Jason frowned slightly. What about it? You said you waited there for Emily. Yeah. How long? Maybe 40 minutes. Reyes nodded slowly. And she never showed. No. The detective slid a photograph across the table. It was an old image from the diner's security camera system, grainy footage recovered during the original investigation. Jason leaned forward slightly to look at it. The timestamp read 10:12 p.m. In the image, Jason's pickup truck could be seen pulling into the parking lot. You arrived around 10:12, Reyes said. Jason nodded again. That sounds right. Reyes tapped the corner of the photo. And the diner closed at 11. Yeah. So you say you waited about 40 minutes. Right. Reyes turned another page and placed a second photograph beside the first. This one showed the parking lot again. But the timestamp read 10:28 p.m. Jason's truck was already gone. The mechanic's jaw tightened. Reyes didn't say anything for a few seconds. Looks like you left after 16 minutes, he said calmly. Jason blinked. That camera must be wrong. The timestamp was verified. Jason leaned back in his chair. Maybe I misremembered. Reyes nodded slowly. That happens. He let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. So if you left at 10:28, where did you go next? Jason's answer came quickly. I told you. I drove around. Where? Jason rubbed his temples. I don't remember exactly. Reyes leaned forward. You remember enough to say you weren't on Pine Ridge Road. Jason's eyes narrowed. I wasn't. Reyes studied him. But you can't remember any other roads you were on. Jason's breathing deepened slightly. It was 20 years ago. The detective didn't argue. Instead, he pulled another sheet from the folder. A printed phone log. We found something interesting, Reyes said. Jason glanced at the paper. What is that? Partial cell tower records. Jason stiffened slightly. Cell phone records from 2001 were limited. Most detailed logs had long since disappeared, but investigators had managed to recover a few fragments from archive carrier systems. Just enough to show something important. Reyes pointed to the page. At 10:43 that night, Emily's phone connected to a tower near Pine Ridge. Jason stared at the table. That's near where her car was found, Reyes continued. Jason didn't answer. Reyes slid the paper closer. You know what else is interesting? Jason looked up slowly. Your phone connected to the same tower 8 minutes earlier. The silence in the room thickened instantly. Jason blinked. That doesn't mean anything. It means you were in the same area. No, it doesn't. Towers overlap. That's true, Reyes said calmly. Jason leaned forward defensively. Lots of people would hit that tower. Sure. Reyes folded his hands together. But it's an odd coincidence. Jason shook his head. You're twisting things. Am I? Reyes opened another photograph from the evidence file. This one showed the dark stretch of Pine Ridge Road again, the same road surrounded by dense Florida forest. This is where Emily drove that night. Jason looked away. She planned to meet someone there. I didn't ask her to go there. Then who did? Jason's jaw clenched. I don't know. Reyes watched him carefully. Jason, your DNA is inside her car. Jason didn't respond. You were in the same cell tower area that night. Still nothing. Witnesses saw 2 vehicles parked on that road. Jason's hands were gripping the table now. And you lied about being inside her car. The words landed heavily. Jason shook his head slowly. You're trying to pin this on me. Reyes didn't raise his voice. I'm trying to understand what happened. Jason's eyes flashed with anger. I didn't kill her. It was the first time he had said those words. Reyes noticed immediately, because the detective had never accused him of murder. That kind of denial often appears when a suspect's mind is racing ahead of the conversation. People defend themselves against crimes that haven't even been mentioned yet. The room grew quiet again. Reyes spoke softly. Then help me understand why she went out there. Jason stared at the ceiling. I told you. I don't know. The detective waited. Seconds passed. Then Jason said something that shifted the entire atmosphere of the interview. She called me. Reyes kept his expression neutral. When? Jason hesitated. Earlier that night. This was new. During the original investigation, Jason had never mentioned a call from Emily. Reyes kept his tone calm. What did she say? Jason rubbed his hands together again. She wanted to talk. About what? I don't know. She just sounded upset. Did she ask you to meet her? Jason hesitated. Maybe. Reyes leaned forward slightly. Where? Jason looked down. She mentioned Pine Ridge. The detective said nothing. For 20 years, Jason Miller had claimed he never went near that road. Now he was admitting Emily herself had brought it up. Did you meet her there? Reyes asked quietly. Jason's eyes darted toward the camera in the corner of the room, then back to the table. No. The denial came slower this time. Less certain. Reyes noticed. Then why were you in that cell tower area? Jason's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He had reached the point detectives often wait for. The moment when the story begins to collapse under its own weight. Jason exhaled heavily. I drove out there, he muttered. Reyes didn't react outwardly. Why? I just wanted to see if she was there. The admission hung in the air. For the first time since the interrogation began, Jason Miller had placed himself on Pine Ridge Road that night, exactly where Emily Carter disappeared. Reyes kept his voice steady. Did you see her car? Jason nodded faintly. Yeah. Did you talk to her? Jason hesitated again. The pause lasted long enough to feel dangerous. Then he whispered something that made the room feel colder. Yes. For nearly 20 years, Jason Miller had insisted he never met Emily Carter that night. Now he had just admitted the opposite. The detective didn't rush the next question. He asked it slowly. What happened after that? Jason's eyes dropped to the floor, and for a long moment he didn't answer at all. Jason Miller stared at the floor as if the answer might be written somewhere in the thin gray lines of the tile beneath his shoes. The interview room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air heavier. Detective Alan Reyes didn't interrupt the silence. Interrogations often reach a delicate point where a suspect stands at the edge of a confession without fully realizing it yet. Push too hard and they retreat. Wait too long and the moment passes. Jason had just done something investigators had been trying to make him do for 20 years. He had placed himself at the scene. Pine Ridge Road, the same dark stretch of forest where Emily Carter's car had been discovered the following morning. Reyes spoke carefully. You said you talked to her. Jason's shoulders lifted slightly as he inhaled. Yeah. What did you talk about? Jason rubbed his forehead slowly. I don't remember everything. Reyes leaned back, letting him speak. She was upset, Jason said quietly. About something at home, about school, I don't know. His voice sounded distant, as if he were replaying the memory through a thick fog. We sat there for a few minutes, he continued. Just talking. Reyes watched him closely. You were both inside her car? Jason shook his head. No. I was standing outside the driver's door. The driver's door. Exactly where his DNA had been found. Reyes didn't mention it. Not yet. What time was this? The detective asked. Jason shrugged slightly. Maybe around 11. That detail aligned almost perfectly with the timeline investigators had built years earlier. Gas station sighting at 10:47. Headlights reported along the road shortly after 11. Reyes flipped to another page in the folder. Witnesses saw 2 vehicles parked there. Jason nodded faintly. That was us. The admission landed quietly but carried enormous weight. For 20 years, Jason Miller had denied being anywhere near Pine Ridge Road. Now he was describing the meeting himself. Reyes asked the next question slowly. How long were you there? Jason rubbed his hands together again. 10 minutes, maybe 15. And then, Jason hesitated. His breathing had become noticeably slower, deeper. Reyes recognized the shift immediately. This was the moment suspects often begin constructing new versions of a story, ones that admit enough truth to explain the evidence, but stop short of full responsibility. Jason finally spoke. She got mad. Why? Jason shrugged again. I don't know. We were arguing. About what? I don't remember. Reyes tilted his head slightly. You drove 3 hours to meet her on a dark road, and you don't remember what the argument was about. Jason looked irritated. It was 20 years ago. The detective didn't argue. Instead, he asked another simple question. Did the argument get physical? Jason shook his head immediately. No. You're sure? Yeah. Reyes opened the folder again and slid a photograph across the table. It showed the interior of Emily's car exactly as investigators found it that morning. Purse on the passenger seat, water bottle in the cup holder, driver's door slightly open. If the argument stayed inside the car, Reyes said calmly, why was the driver's door open? Jason stared at the photo. I don't know. You said you were standing outside. Yeah. So the door was already open. Jason nodded. Probably. Reyes studied his face. And then you left. Jason nodded again. Yeah. You just drove away. Yes. And Emily stayed there. Jason swallowed. I guess. The detective leaned forward slightly. When was the last time you saw her? Jason looked down. When I left. Was she inside the car? Yeah. Alive. Jason's head snapped up. What kind of question is that? Reyes held his gaze. A simple one. Jason hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes. The words sounded fragile. Reyes let the silence stretch again. Outside the room, deputies moved through the hallway. Phones rang in distant offices. Normal life continued inside the building while the truth about a 20-year-old disappearance slowly clawed its way toward the surface. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I told you everything, he said quietly. Reyes didn't respond immediately, because something about Jason's story still didn't make sense. If Jason left Emily alive on that road, several critical questions remained. Why did her car stay there overnight? Why did her phone disappear? And most importantly, where did Emily go? Reyes asked the question directly. What happened after you drove away? Jason shook his head. I don't know. You didn't see anyone else? No. No other cars? No. Reyes flipped to the witness statement again. The neighbor who had seen 2 sets of headlights, and then one vehicle leaving quickly. You're saying you were the only person there with her. Jason's fingers tightened around each other. I guess so. Reyes tapped the page gently. Then help me understand something. Jason looked up. Emily Carter vanished that night. Jason said nothing. No phone activity. No bank transactions. No confirmed sightings. Reyes' voice remained calm but firm. She disappeared into thin air. Jason stared at the wall. And you were the last person to see her alive. The words lingered heavily between them. Jason's breathing had grown louder now. I didn't do anything to her. Reyes watched him carefully. Then where did she go? Jason didn't answer. The silence stretched again. Finally Jason spoke, but his voice sounded weaker than before. Maybe someone else came. Reyes tilted his head. You just said no one else was there. Jason shifted in his seat. Maybe after I left. Who? I don't know. Reyes studied him for a long moment. That answer felt less like truth and more like desperation. Because if Jason was the last person there, then the timeline pointed to him whether he liked it or not. The detective opened the folder again. One final photograph remained inside. He slid it slowly across the table. This one was different. It showed the dense woods surrounding Pine Ridge Road, thick Florida underbrush stretching deep into the darkness beyond the roadside. This area was searched for weeks, Reyes said quietly. Jason looked at the image. Dogs, helicopters, hundreds of volunteers. Jason swallowed. They never found her. The room felt colder. Reyes leaned forward slightly. Jason, people don't just disappear like that. Jason's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. Not without help. For a moment, it looked as if Jason might say something. Something important. But instead, he shook his head slowly. I told you, he muttered. I didn't kill her. Again, the same denial. Again, for a crime that hadn't been formally accused. Reyes closed the folder. The interrogation had reached its limit for the day. But something crucial had already happened inside this room. Jason Miller had admitted being on Pine Ridge Road. He had admitted speaking with Emily Carter. And he had admitted leaving her there shortly before she vanished forever. For 20 years, investigators had suspected exactly that. Now it was on record. But the real question, the one that mattered more than anything, still hung unanswered in the quiet space between detective and suspect. If Jason Miller left Emily Carter alive on that road, then why had no one ever seen her again? After the interview ended, Jason Miller sat alone in the interrogation room for several minutes before a deputy finally opened the door and told him he was free to go. Free. It was a strange word in a case like this. Jason walked out of the sheriff's office that evening under a fading orange sky, the same way he had walked away from Pine Ridge Road 20 years earlier, leaving behind a trail of questions that still refused to settle. Detective Alan Reyes watched from the hallway window as Jason crossed the parking lot. There was no dramatic arrest, no confession, just a man getting into his truck and driving away. But the case had changed. For 2 decades, Jason Miller had insisted he never saw Emily Carter that night. Now he had admitted the opposite. He had met her, spoken with her, argued with her, and left her alone on a dark road minutes before she disappeared forever. That single shift in his story was enough to reopen investigative doors that had been locked for years. Back inside the office, Reyes spread the entire case file across a long conference table. Maps, photographs, witness statements. The timeline investigators had built in 2001 now needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, because Jason's admission changed the most important part of the story. The last confirmed moment of Emily Carter's life. Reyes wrote the sequence on a whiteboard. 8:15 p.m., Emily leaves home. 10:47 p.m., seen at the gas station. Around 11 p.m., arrives at Pine Ridge Road. Shortly after 11 o'clock, Jason Miller arrives. They talk. They argue. Jason leaves. After that, nothing. The blank space at the end of the timeline stretched across the board like a dark shadow. That was where the mystery lived. If Jason's story was true, then Emily was alive when he drove away, which meant something else happened in the minutes or hours that followed. The question was what? Reyes began reviewing the search records from 2001 again. Hundreds of volunteers had combed the Pine Ridge area for nearly 2 weeks after Emily vanished. Law enforcement officers had searched miles of woodland, drainage ditches, abandoned structures, and nearby lakes. But the truth about wilderness searches is something investigators understand all too well. They are never perfect. Dense vegetation can hide a body only yards from a search line. Flooding, animals, and time can erase traces quickly in Florida's subtropical environment. It was entirely possible that Emily Carter had been somewhere in those woods all along, just waiting to be found. 2 weeks later, a new search operation began. But this time, the technology looked very different from what investigators had in 2001. Ground-penetrating radar, high-resolution aerial drones, specialized cadaver dogs trained to detect decomposition even after many years. The Pine Ridge forest had grown thicker in the decades since Emily disappeared. Tall pines now towered over areas that were once open brush, their branches forming dense shadows over the narrow dirt road. Early one morning, search teams gathered near the same stretch of road where Emily's car had been found. Detective Reyes stood beside them, studying the landscape. The forest was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy when you know something terrible might have happened there. Search teams moved slowly through the trees, carefully scanning the ground for disturbances that might have survived years of weather and erosion. For hours, nothing appeared, just dirt, roots, fallen branches. Then one of the cadaver dogs stopped. The animal froze beside a shallow depression roughly 30 yards from the roadside. Its handler raised a hand immediately. The signal rippled through the search team. Everyone stopped moving. Reyes approached slowly. The dog remained fixed in place, nose pointed toward the ground. Cadaver dogs do not react randomly. When trained animals indicate a scent associated with human decomposition, investigators take it seriously. Very seriously. The team marked the location and began digging carefully. The soil was soft from years of decaying vegetation. Shovels moved slowly. 10 inches down. 12 inches. Then one of the searchers stopped suddenly. Hold on. Everyone leaned closer. Something pale had appeared beneath the soil. Not stone. Not wood. Bone. For a moment, no one spoke. Reyes felt a tightening in his chest as the team gently brushed dirt away from the surface. More bone emerged. Curved. Thin. Human. The excavation expanded carefully over the next hour. What the searchers uncovered confirmed the fear that had hung over the case for 2 decades. Human skeletal remains buried beneath the forest floor. The position of the bones suggested a body had been placed there intentionally. Not deep, but hidden. Nearby, Investigators recovered fragments of clothing that had survived the years underground, a small metal zipper, faded fabric threads, and one object that made Reyes' pulse quicken, a silver necklace, simple, delicate, with a tiny pendant shaped like a star. Reyes had seen that necklace before. It appeared in several photographs inside the Carter case file, Emily wearing it in school pictures, smiling at the camera. There was no longer any doubt. Emily Carter had been there, 30 yards from the road where her car was found, buried in the woods, for 20 years. The discovery transformed the investigation instantly. What had once been a missing persons case was now officially a homicide, and the timeline investigators had reconstructed suddenly became far more dangerous for one person in particular, Jason Miller, because he had just admitted something that now carried enormous legal weight. He was the last known person to see Emily Carter alive, and her body had been found exactly where he said he left her, hidden beneath the forest floor. That evening, as the remains were transported to the medical examiner's office for confirmation, Detective Reyes stood alone beside Pine Ridge Road. The sun had already begun sinking behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the dirt road, just as they must have on that night in June 2001. Reyes looked toward the spot where the search team had uncovered the shallow grave. Jason Miller had told investigators he left Emily sitting in her car. But Emily Carter had never driven away. She had never returned home. Instead, she had ended up buried in the woods only a short distance from that road. And the man who had claimed for 20 years that he wasn't even there had now admitted he was. The case was no longer a cold mystery. It had become something far more dangerous, a homicide investigation with one living witness. And that witness had already begun changing his story. The moment Emily Carter's remains were discovered beneath the soil of the Pine Ridge Forest, the entire case changed shape. For 20 years it had lived in the gray space between suspicion and proof, a disappearance surrounded by rumors, theories, and unanswered questions. Now the truth had finally surfaced from the ground itself. Emily Carter was no longer a missing person. She was a homicide victim, and the forest that had stayed silent for 2 decades had suddenly begun to speak. The excavation site was sealed immediately. Yellow tape stretched between trees as crime scene investigators carefully documented every inch of the area. Photographs captured the position of the remains. Soil samples were collected. Each fragment of bone was carefully placed into evidence bags and labeled. Detective Alan Reyes stood just outside the perimeter, watching the process unfold. For a long time, the case had felt like a puzzle missing its final piece. Now that piece had appeared, but instead of providing answers, it had opened an entirely new set of questions. The most immediate one was obvious. How had Emily Carter died? 2 days later, the remains arrived at the regional medical examiner's office. Forensic anthropologists began the painstaking process of examining bones that had spent 20 years buried in humid Florida soil. Time had done what time always does. Soft tissue was gone. But bones, even after decades, can still tell a story. The skull revealed the first clue. A fracture. Clean. Blunt force trauma along the left side. The kind of injury consistent with a heavy object striking the head. The forensic pathologist studied the damage carefully beneath bright examination lights. The angle suggested a downward strike. Forceful. Intentional. The conclusion appeared in the autopsy report several days later. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull. Manner of death, homicide. The report also included something else investigators had been waiting for. Estimated time of death. Based on bone condition, soil interaction, and the timeline of disappearance, the medical examiner concluded Emily Carter likely died on the same night she vanished. June 14, 2001. That finding collapsed the timeline into a terrifyingly narrow window. Because Jason Miller had already admitted something that now placed him directly inside that window. He had been there. He had spoken with Emily. He had argued with her. And he had claimed to leave shortly before she disappeared. Detective Reyes read the report twice before placing it back on his desk. Then he picked up the phone. Jason Miller needed to come back in. When the call reached Jason that evening, his reaction was immediate. "What do you mean you found her?" His voice sounded strained. Reyes answered calmly. "We located remains in the Pine Ridge area. A long silence followed on the other end of the line. Jason spoke again, quieter this time. That doesn't mean anything. Reyes didn't respond to that. We'd like you to come in and talk. Another pause. Do I need a lawyer? The question hung in the air. For investigators, that moment is always significant. Innocent people sometimes ask about lawyers. But the tone matters. The timing matters. Jason had asked the question less than 10 seconds after hearing Emily's body had been found. That's your choice, Reyes replied. The silence stretched longer this time. Then Jason said something that caught the detective's attention. I already told you what happened. Reyes's voice remained steady. Then come tell us again. The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon. When Jason arrived at the sheriff's office, he looked different from the man who had walked out of the building just weeks earlier. More tired, more tense. The confidence he carried during the previous interview had faded slightly. Detective Reyes noticed it immediately. They sat across from each other in the same interrogation room. Same table, same camera watching from the corner, but the atmosphere felt entirely different now. Reyes placed the autopsy report on the table. Jason stared at it. They confirmed it's her, Reyes said quietly. Jason didn't touch the paper. Reyes continued. She died the night she disappeared. Jason's jaw tightened. I told you I left her alive. Reyes slid another photograph across the table. The excavation site. The shallow grave. Jason looked at it for only a second before looking away. She was buried about 30 yards from the road. Jason said nothing. And the cause of death was blunt force trauma. Jason's eyes flickered. Reyes leaned forward slightly. She was struck in the head. Silence filled the room. Jason's breathing had grown noticeably heavier. You told me you argued, Reyes continued. Jason nodded slowly. But you said nothing physical happened. That's right. Reyes watched him carefully. Then how did she end up dead in the woods? Jason shook his head. I don't know. The detective waited. You were the last person to see her. Jason's hands gripped the table again. I already told you. Reyes opened the folder. Inside were photographs of a skull fracture taken during the autopsy. He turned one toward Jason. Jason looked at it. His face tightened. That kind of injury doesn't happen by accident, Reyes said calmly. Jason pushed the photo away. I didn't do that. Reyes didn't react. You said the argument stayed verbal. It did. Then who hit her? Jason shook his head again. I don't know. Reyes let the silence stretch for several seconds before asking the question that had been waiting for 20 years. What were you arguing about? Jason looked exhausted now. It was stupid. Tell me. Jason rubbed his face. She wanted money. Reyes blinked. Money. Jason nodded. She said she needed help. How much? I don't remember. Reyes studied him. And that turned into an argument. Jason nodded again. She thought I owed her. Owed her for what? Jason hesitated. The pause was long enough to feel dangerous. Reyes leaned forward slightly. For what, Jason? Jason stared at the wall. For a favor. What kind of favor? Jason swallowed. But before he could answer, the door behind Reyes opened quietly. Another detective stepped inside and handed Reyes a thin evidence envelope. Reyes opened it. Inside was a small object recovered during the excavation at Pine Ridge. A rusted metal tool, roughly 8 inches long. A tire iron, the kind commonly kept in vehicles for changing a flat tire. Reyes placed it gently on the table. Jason stared at it. The room fell completely silent. This was found in the same grave as Emily's remains, Reyes said softly. Jason's face drained of color. Reyes spoke again, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. And we just received the lab results. Jason didn't move. The detective's eyes remained locked on him. Your fingerprints are on it. The tire iron sat on the metal table like a silent witness. Rust had eaten into its surface after 2 decades buried in damp Florida soil, but the shape was still unmistakable. Heavy, solid, a tool designed for leverage, not violence. Yet in the wrong hands, it could become something else entirely. Jason Miller stared at it without blinking. For several seconds, the room felt frozen. Detective Alan Reyes watched the subtle shifts in Jason's face, the tightening of the jaw, the shallow breaths, the slow realization settling in that the walls around his story were collapsing. Your fingerprints are on it, Reyes repeated quietly. Jason's lips parted slightly. That doesn't prove anything. His voice sounded thin now. Reyes didn't argue immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to deepen, forcing Jason to sit with the weight of the object in front of him. Then the detective spoke again. That tire iron was buried in the same shallow grave as Emily Carter. Jason swallowed. Reyes continued, and the medical examiner confirmed her skull fracture is consistent with a strike from a blunt metal object. Jason's eyes darted away from the table. I didn't hit her. The denial came automatically. Reyes leaned forward slightly. Then how did your fingerprints end up on the weapon that killed her? Jason shook his head slowly. I must have touched it earlier. When? Jason hesitated. I don't know. Earlier that night? Maybe. Reyes tapped the table gently with his finger. So now you're saying you handled a tire iron while standing beside Emily's car. Jason didn't answer. Reyes' voice remained calm but relentless. And shortly after that, she was struck in the head and buried 30 yards into the woods. Jason's breathing had grown louder again. I didn't bury anyone. Reyes studied him. You told us you left her sitting in the car. Jason nodded weakly. That's right. But she wasn't in the car when we found her. Jason looked down. And the weapon that killed her was buried with her. Jason's hands trembled slightly. The detective waited, because this was the point where reality becomes impossible to ignore. Evidence doesn't argue. It simply sits there, heavy, silent, unavoidable. Jason rubbed his face with both hands. This is crazy, he muttered. Reyes didn't react. What happened on that road, Jason? Jason shook his head again. I told you. You argued. Yes. And then you left. Yes. Reyes leaned closer. But Emily Carter never left that road. Jason's eyes flickered toward the tire iron again. For the first time since the interrogation began, his voice cracked slightly. I didn't mean to. The room went completely still. Reyes did not interrupt. Jason stared at the table, breathing slowly as if realizing the words had already escaped. I didn't mean to, he repeated quietly. The detective spoke carefully. Tell me what happened. Jason closed his eyes. For a long moment, it looked like he might retreat back into silence. Then he spoke. She got out of the car. Reyes listened. She was yelling at me. About the money. Jason nodded faintly. She said if I didn't help her, she was going to tell people. Tell them what? Jason hesitated. Reyes didn't push. Jason finally exhaled. That we had been seeing each other. Reyes frowned slightly. You mean dating? Jason shook his head. No. The word carried a different meaning. Something darker. Jason stared at the floor. She said she'd ruin my life. Reyes watched him closely. So you hit her? Jason shook his head quickly. No. Then what happened? Jason's breathing quickened again. She grabbed the tire iron from her trunk. Reyes raised an eyebrow. And then, we were both holding it. Jason's hands moved slightly as if replaying the struggle. She slipped. Slipped. Jason nodded rapidly. She fell and hit her head. Reyes remained silent, because investigators hear versions of that story often. Accidents, falls, misunderstandings. Yet the medical examiner's report had been clear. The skull fracture was not consistent with a fall. It was consistent with a strike. Reyes asked the question slowly. If she slipped, why bury her? Jason froze. The words landed like a hammer. For several seconds, he didn't move. Reyes waited. Jason finally whispered something almost too quiet to hear. I panicked. The detective leaned forward slightly. Say that again. Jason looked defeated now. I panicked. What did you do? Jason swallowed hard. She wasn't moving. Reyes kept his voice steady. Did you check if she was breathing? Jason shook his head weakly. I thought she was dead. So you buried her. Jason nodded once. The admission filled the room like thick smoke. 20 years of silence had just cracked open. Reyes asked one final question. Why did you lie about being there? Jason stared at the tire iron again. Because if I told the truth. He trailed off. Reyes finished the sentence for him. They would have known. Jason said nothing. The detective leaned back in his chair. For 20 years, Emily Carter's disappearance had been an unsolved mystery haunting a small Florida town. Now the truth was finally sitting on the table. A late-night meeting, an argument, a violent moment that ended a 17-year-old girl's life, and a shallow grave hidden in the woods beside Pine Ridge Road. Jason Miller lowered his head into his hands. The story he had protected for 2 decades had finally come apart piece by piece. But even now, Detective Reyes knew something important. Confessions don't always mean closure, because sometimes the version of events a suspect tells isn't the whole truth. The confession did not arrive with shouting. There were no dramatic outbursts, no slammed fists, no sudden collapse of emotion the way movies often portray the moment when the truth finally breaks free. Instead, it came quietly in fragments inside a small interview room under the cold glow of fluorescent lights. Jason Miller sat with his head in his hands, staring down at the metal table where the rusted tire iron still rested between him and Detective Alan Reyes. For 20 years, the story had been buried just like Emily Carter had been buried, hidden beneath layers of silence, denial, and time. Now it was beginning to surface. But even as Jason spoke, Reyes could hear the gaps, the hesitation, the careful wording. "I panicked," Jason had said. 2 words that investigators hear often when suspects attempt to transform violence into something accidental. Panic is a convenient explanation. Panic blurs intent. Panic softens responsibility. But the evidence sitting on the table told a different story. Emily Carter hadn't simply slipped and fallen. Her skull fracture was consistent with a direct strike. Forceful. Deliberate. Reyes folded his hands calmly. "Walk me through it again." Jason looked exhausted now, the weight of the last hour pressing heavily on his face. "We were arguing," he repeated. "About the money." Jason nodded. "She said she was going to tell people about us." "About the relationship." Jason looked away. "Yes." Reyes watched him carefully. "Why would that ruin your life?" Jason didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Because she was 17, the room seemed to grow colder. That detail had never appeared clearly during the original investigation. Back in 2001, rumors had circulated among classmates that Emily and Jason had some kind of complicated connection, but no one had ever confirmed anything. Now the truth sat plainly in the air. Jason had been 19. Emily had been 17. Still a minor. Reyes said nothing, allowing Jason's own words to settle into the room. "She said if I didn't give her the money," Jason continued, "she'd tell her parents, tell the school, tell everyone." "And that scared you?" Jason nodded slowly. "Yes." Reyes leaned forward slightly. "So you fought over the tire iron." Jason rubbed his temples. "She grabbed it first. And then, we were both holding it." Reyes paused before asking the question again. "Who swung it?" Jason's breathing became uneven. "I don't know." Reyes held his gaze. "The medical examiner says the strike came from above." Jason closed his eyes. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then Jason whispered something that sounded more like surrender than explanation. "I hit her." The words landed softly, but they carried the weight of 20 years. Reyes didn't interrupt. Jason continued speaking, his voice hollow. "I didn't mean to hit her that hard." He swallowed. "She just dropped." Reyes imagined the scene in his mind. A dark road. 2 young people standing beside a car under the shadow of tall pines. Anger rising. Fear mixing with desperation. And one moment where control disappears. "What did you do next?" Reyes asked quietly. Jason's eyes were fixed on the table. "I tried to wake her up." "Did she respond?" Jason shook his head. "No." "Did you call for help?" Jason's laugh was short and bitter. "No." "Why not?" Jason's answer came instantly. "Because I knew what I'd done." The room went silent again. Reyes looked at the tire iron. "Then you buried her?" Jason nodded slowly. "I dragged her into the woods. 30 yards. "Yes." "How long did it take?" Jason shrugged weakly. "I don't know." "Did anyone see you?" "No." "Did you drive her car afterward?" Jason shook his head. "No." "Why leave it there?" Jason stared into the distance. "I thought it would look like she ran away." Reyes absorbed the statement quietly. That single decision had shaped the investigation for years. Without a body, the case had floated in uncertainty, missing person, possible runaway, possible abduction. Exactly the confusion Jason had hoped for. What about her phone? Reyes asked. Jason hesitated. I threw it in a lake. Which lake? Jason sighed. I don't remember. Reyes made a note but didn't press further. Phones from 2001 rarely survive underwater for decades. That evidence was likely gone forever. The detective leaned back in his chair, studying the man across from him. Jason Miller looked nothing like the 19-year-old mechanic who had stood beside Emily Carter's car on Pine Ridge Road that night. Time had changed his face, his hair, his life, but the secret he carried had remained frozen in that moment. A moment that had now finally surfaced after 2 decades. Why did you lie all these years? Reyes asked. Jason looked up slowly. Because nobody found her. His voice sounded strangely calm now. As long as she was missing, there was always doubt. Reyes nodded. Jason had understood something very important. Without a body, prosecutors often struggle to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. The absence of physical proof creates room for alternative theories, runaways, kidnappings, accidents. Jason had relied on that doubt for 20 years. But Pine Ridge Road had eventually given up its secret, and now the doubt was gone. Reyes closed the folder slowly. Outside the interview room, the sheriff's office continued its normal rhythm. Phones ringing, deputies moving through hallways, the quiet machinery of law enforcement doing its work. Inside this room, however, a story that began in the summer of 2001 had finally reached its end. Emily Carter had stepped out of her house at 8:15 that evening expecting an ordinary night. Instead, she had driven into a meeting that would become the final moment of her life. A quiet road, an argument, a single violent strike, and 20 years of silence that followed. Later that night, as Jason Miller was escorted from the interrogation room in handcuffs, Detective Alan Reyes walked outside into the warm Florida air. The sky above Pine Ridge County was dark again, just as it had been on the night Emily vanished. For 2 decades, her story had lived as a cold case, one of those mysteries that linger in the background of a community, whispered about but never resolved. Now the truth had surfaced from beneath the forest floor. But the truth carries its own kind of weight, because even when justice finally arrives, it always comes too late for the person who never made it home. Night settled over Pine Ridge County the same way it always had. Slowly, quietly, the darkness slipping between rows of tall Florida pines until the road that had once swallowed Emily Carter seemed to disappear again into shadow. But something had changed. For 20 years, that road carried a mystery. Now it carried a confession. Jason Miller sat alone in a holding cell inside the county jail, the echo of the interrogation still lingering in his mind like a noise he couldn't turn off. The metal bench was cold beneath him. Fluorescent lights hummed above. Somewhere down the corridor, a steel door slammed shut with a hollow clang that reverberated through the concrete walls. The life he had built over 2 decades, quiet job, routine days, the careful illusion that the past had been buried, had collapsed in a single afternoon. Confessions do that. They end stories suspects have been telling themselves for years. Across town, Detective Alan Reyes sat at his desk reviewing the final statement transcript. The document was already thick with notes, timestamps, and annotations marking the points where Jason's story had shifted, cracked, and finally broken. The moment that mattered most appeared halfway down the page. I hit her. 3 simple words. But those words closed a case that had once seemed impossible to solve. Reyes leaned back in his chair and stared at the wall where the timeline of the investigation was still written in black marker. June 14th, 2001. 8:15 p.m. Emily leaves home. 10:47 p.m. Gas station sighting. 11 p.m. Arrives at Pine Ridge Road. Shortly after, Jason Miller arrives. Argument. Strike. Burial. The timeline ended there. 2 decades of silence filled the empty space that followed. Until now, the next steps in the process moved quickly. The district attorney's office reviewed the evidence overnight. Jason's confession, combined with the forensic findings and the discovery of Emily's remains, provided more than enough to formally charge him. The following morning, a judge signed the warrant. Jason Miller was charged with second-degree murder. The news spread across Pine Ridge County faster than anyone expected. By noon, local television stations were broadcasting updates. Old photographs of Emily Carter reappeared on screens for the first time in years. The same senior portrait that had once been printed on missing person flyers now framed beneath bold headlines announcing the case had finally been solved. For many people in the town, the story felt like something from another lifetime. Some residents had moved away. Some witnesses had grown older. Some classmates barely remembered the details anymore. But Emily's family had never forgotten. When detectives knocked on the Carter family's door that afternoon, Emily's mother already knew something had happened. She had seen the news alerts. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Detective Reyes told her the words that had taken 20 years to reach her doorstep. "We found her." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Reyes had experienced during the investigation. Emily's mother closed her eyes slowly. For decades, she had lived with a strange kind of uncertainty, the painful possibility that her daughter might still be alive somewhere. Now that uncertainty was gone. In its place stood something more final. Truth. But truth carries its own kind of grief. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, reporters gathered along the edge of Pine Ridge Road. The forest looked the same as it always had, quiet, unmoving, the tall pines whispering softly in the wind. Yellow crime scene tape still fluttered near the excavation site where search teams had uncovered the shallow grave just days earlier. A sheriff's department spokesperson stepped in front of the cameras. "For 20 years," he said, "this case remained one of the most painful, unsolved mysteries in our county." Behind him, the dark road stretched into the trees. Thanks to new forensic technology and the persistence of investigators, we were able to uncover the truth about what happened here in 2001. The statement was brief, professional, but the emotional weight behind it was impossible to ignore. Cold cases are rarely just files sitting in storage boxes. They are memories. They are families waiting for answers. They are unfinished stories that echo through communities long after the headlines disappear. Emily Carter's case had lived in that space for 2 decades. Now it had finally moved forward, but even as the investigation reached its conclusion, some questions would never fully disappear. What exactly had been said during that final argument on Pine Ridge Road? What moment had pushed Jason Miller from fear into violence? And how many nights had he spent replaying that moment in his mind, knowing the truth was buried beneath the forest floor? Those answers may never be fully known, because the past, once it's buried long enough, rarely reveals every detail. Weeks later, the courtroom filled with quiet tension as Jason Miller stood before a judge for his initial hearing. The same man who had once walked freely away from Pine Ridge Road now stood in handcuffs beneath the harsh lighting of the courtroom. The charges were read aloud: second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence. Jason listened without speaking. For the first time in 20 years, the story of Emily Carter was no longer a mystery. It was a criminal case moving steadily through the justice system. Outside the courthouse, the world continued as it always does. Cars moved along the highway. People went to work. Students filled classrooms at the same high school Emily had once attended. Life continued, but deep inside the Pine Ridge Forest, the place where Emily Carter had been hidden for 2 decades now stood empty. The ground had been carefully restored after investigators finished their work. Pine needles once again covered the soil. Wind moved softly through the branches above. To anyone passing by, it would look like just another quiet stretch of woodland. But for those who knew the story, that patch of earth would always hold something else. A reminder of how easily a life can vanish, of how long silence can last, and of how even the coldest cases sometimes refuse to stay buried forever. The courtroom was quiet the morning Jason Miller returned for his first full hearing. Not the kind of quiet that comes from calm, but the kind that settles over a room when everyone present knows they are watching the final chapter of a story that began long before many of them ever stepped inside that building. 2 decades earlier, the disappearance of Emily Carter had been a headline, a mystery that unsettled a small Florida town. Flyers taped to street poles, candlelight vigils outside a high school football field, a mother standing in front of television cameras asking a question no parent should ever have to ask. Where is my daughter? Now the answer had finally surfaced, and the man responsible sat in a courtroom wearing a county-issued jumpsuit, his hands folded quietly in front of him. Jason Miller looked smaller than he had in the interrogation room. Confessions have a way of doing that. They strip away the layers people build around themselves for years. Defenses, excuses, carefully rehearsed denials. What remains afterward is often just a tired person facing consequences they spent decades trying to avoid. Detective Alan Reyes sat quietly in the second row behind the prosecution table. For him, the hearing felt strangely surreal. For months he had lived inside the details of the Carter investigation, reading transcripts, studying faded photographs, replaying timelines again and again until the night of June 14th, 2001 had begun to feel almost present. Now that story was unfolding inside a courtroom. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The charges were read once more. Second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence. Jason listened with his head lowered slightly, the same calm expression fixed on his face. When the judge asked how he intended to plead, Jason's attorney spoke for him. Not guilty. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. It wasn't unusual. Even with a confession, defense attorneys often enter a not guilty plea at the early stages of a case while they examine the evidence and prepare legal strategy. Still, hearing the words created an odd tension in the room, because everyone present already knew what Jason had said during the interrogation. I hit her. The words had been recorded, documented, signed. Yet inside a courtroom, the process must follow its own path. Outside the building, reporters waited along the courthouse steps. Cameras pointed toward the doors, ready to capture the moment Jason Miller would eventually be escorted back into a transport vehicle. News of the arrest had spread far beyond Pine Ridge County. Cold cases that suddenly break open tend to capture national attention. There is something about the passage of time, about mysteries that linger for decades before finally unraveling, that draws people in, especially when the truth turns out to be something tragically simple. Not a complex conspiracy, not a stranger lurking in the shadows, just someone the victim already knew. Back inside the courtroom, the judge scheduled the next hearing and addressed the matter of bail. The prosecution argued immediately that Jason Miller posed a flight risk. The charges were severe, the evidence substantial, and the potential sentence significant. The judge agreed. Bail was denied. Jason would remain in custody while the case moved toward trial. As deputies escorted him out of the room, he glanced briefly toward the gallery where Emily Carter's family sat together. It was the first time their eyes had met in 20 years. Emily's mother did not speak. She simply watched him pass. For 2 decades, she had lived with uncertainty, the long, exhausting stretch of wondering whether her daughter might still be alive somewhere, whether the truth might one day appear. Now that truth had arrived. But closure is a complicated word. It suggests an ending. And for families who lose someone to violence, endings rarely feel complete. After the hearing, Detective Reyes stepped outside into the bright Florida afternoon. Reporters called questions as he moved toward the parking lot. Detective Reyes, do you believe justice has finally been served? He paused for a moment before answering. Justice. It was another word that sounds simple but rarely is. We follow the evidence, Reyes said quietly. And the evidence led us here. That was the truth. Cold cases are not solved by dramatic breakthroughs alone. They are solved by persistence, by investigators willing to reopen dusty files, revisit forgotten details, and look again at the small inconsistencies that others once overlooked. In Emily Carter's case, the truth had been hiding in those small spaces. A faint smear of DNA on a car door. A timeline that didn't quite fit. A suspect who had repeated the same story for 20 years, until the evidence forced it to change. Later that evening, Reyes drove once more past Pine Ridge Road. The forest looked unchanged. Tall pines rising into the fading sky. A narrow dirt road disappearing into shadow. If you didn't know the story, you would never guess what had happened there. You would never know that beneath those trees, a 17-year-old girl's life had ended in a moment of fear and anger, or that the truth had remained hidden beneath the soil for 20 years. Reyes pulled his car to the side of the road and stepped out. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. Somewhere deeper in the woods, insects hummed softly in the growing darkness. For a moment he simply stood there, looking toward the place where investigators had uncovered the shallow grave. Cold cases leave a strange imprint on the people who work them. They linger. They echo. Because every solved mystery also carries the weight of time lost. 20 years of silence. 20 years of questions. 20 years in which a family waited for answers that never came. Until one day they finally did. The road remained quiet as night settled over the forest again. But the mystery that once haunted Pine Ridge was gone. In its place remained something simpler, heavier, and far more real. The truth about what happened on a dark Florida road in the summer of 2001. A truth that had waited 20 years to be heard. And a reminder that even the coldest cases never completely stop whispering. Weeks passed, but the story refused to fade. Cold cases rarely disappear quietly once they finally break open. In fact, the opposite often happens. The moment the truth surfaces, the past begins to unfold again. Old memories resurfacing, forgotten details returning, people who once stayed silent suddenly finding the courage to speak. Pine Ridge County felt that shift almost immediately. The arrest of Jason Miller had turned a 20-year mystery into something raw and immediate again. Old newspaper clippings were pulled from storage. Television stations replayed footage from 2001. Emily Carter's school portrait appearing on screens beside headlines announcing the case had finally been solved. But as investigators know well, solving a case and understanding it completely are not always the same thing. Detective Alan Reyes was reminded of that fact almost 3 weeks after Jason's arrest. The phone call came late in the afternoon. The voice on the other end sounded hesitant. "My name is Daniel Harper," the man said. I think I might know something about the Carter case." Reyes leaned forward slightly in his chair. Cold case investigators treat calls like this carefully. Most turn out to be rumors, half-remembered gossip, or theories that have already been explored years earlier. But sometimes they're not. "What kind of information?" Reyes asked. There was a pause before the man answered. "I knew Jason back then." That alone was enough to hold Reyes' attention. Daniel Harper explained that he and Jason had worked together briefly at a small garage in the summer of 2001. They weren't close friends, but they spent enough time around each other to notice things. And according to Daniel, something had always bothered him about the days after Emily Carter disappeared. "Jason came into work acting weird," Daniel said. "How so?" Reyes asked. "He looked like he hadn't slept." Reyes made a note. "Did he say anything?" Another pause. "At first, no. But later..." Daniel exhaled slowly. "A few nights later we were drinking after work. And he said something." "What did he say?" The answer came quietly. "He said sometimes one mistake can ruin your whole life." Reyes remained silent, letting the man continue. Daniel explained that he didn't think much of the comment at the time. People say strange things when they're drinking, especially young men dealing with stress. But after Emily Carter's disappearance became front-page news, the memory started to bother him. Still, he never spoke to police. Until now. Why come forward after 20 years? Reyes asked. Daniel's answer was simple. "Because now you found her." That sentence hung in the air. For 2 decades, the case had existed in uncertainty. Without a body, the truth remained blurry. People doubted their own suspicions. But once Emily Carter's remains were discovered in the Pine Ridge forest, something changed. Doubt disappeared, and memories began resurfacing. Reyes thanked the man for the information and added the statement to the growing case file. It wasn't evidence strong enough to change the prosecution strategy, but it added something investigators value almost as much as physical proof. Context. A glimpse into the mindset of a man who had spent 20 years living with what happened on that road. Meanwhile, inside the county jail, Jason Miller's world had grown smaller. Days passed slowly inside the concrete walls of the detention center. Time inside a cell moves differently than it does outside. The hours stretch. Nights feel longer. For someone who had lived freely for 2 decades after committing a crime, the adjustment was brutal. Jason spent most of his time sitting on the edge of the narrow metal bunk, staring at the floor. His attorneys had already begun building a defense. Their strategy was predictable. They would argue that Emily's death had been accidental, that the argument escalated unexpectedly, that Jason panicked afterward and made terrible decisions, but never intended to kill her. Legally, the distinction mattered, because proving intent can change the difference between murder and a lesser charge like manslaughter. The problem for the defense was the evidence, the skull fracture, the buried weapon, and Jason's own recorded confession. Each of those pieces painted a picture prosecutors would present to a jury, a picture of fear turning into violence on a quiet road surrounded by trees. Back in Pine Ridge County, life slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Students walked the halls of the same high school Emily Carter once attended. Cars passed along the highway near the forest. But the story lingered. Sometimes closure doesn't arrive as a single moment. Sometimes it comes in waves. The discovery of Emily's remains had brought answers. Jason's confession had explained what happened in those final minutes. Yet one thing still lingered in the minds of many people who followed the case. Why that road? Why Pine Ridge? Detective Reyes had asked himself the same question more than once. Because the location wasn't random. Emily had driven there intentionally. She had circled the road on the map found inside her car. She expected to meet Jason there, which meant that the place where her life ended had once been planned as a meeting point. Not a crime scene. Late one evening, months after the confession, Reyes returned to the area again. The road looked almost identical to the way it had in the old crime scene photographs. Tall pines, thick underbrush, a narrow dirt path winding into darkness. If someone stood there long enough, they could almost imagine the scene as it must have looked in June 2001. 2 cars parked along the roadside. A teenage girl stepping out of the driver's seat. A young man walking toward her through the dim glow of headlights. Words exchanged. Voices rising. Fear building. And one moment that changed everything. Reyes stood quietly for a few minutes before returning to his car. Cold cases often end with a sense of relief for investigators. But they also leave behind something else. A lingering awareness that the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, always carries consequences. 20 years of silence had protected Jason Miller. But silence has limits. And eventually, the forest gave up what it had been holding. Emily Carter's story had waited 2 decades to be told. Now it had been. And the road where it all happened would never feel quite as quiet again. Spring arrived slowly in Pine Ridge County, the warm Florida air returning with the same heavy humidity that had hung over the town the night Emily Carter disappeared nearly 25 years earlier. Time had continued to move forward in small, ordinary ways. New houses built, old businesses closing, children growing into adults who barely remember the story that once gripped the community. But inside the county courthouse, the past had returned with full force. The trial of Jason Miller was about to begin. For the Carter family, the courtroom felt like the final doorway they had been walking toward for 2 decades. Every step leading here had taken years, years of unanswered questions, quiet anniversaries, birthdays that passed without Emily, and the lingering uncertainty that came with not knowing the truth. Now the truth would be laid out in front of a jury. Detective Alan Reyes arrived early on the first morning of the trial. The courthouse corridors were already filling with attorneys carrying stacks of documents, reporters preparing their notes, and deputies guiding potential jurors toward the selection room. Cold case trials often carry a different atmosphere than fresh investigations. Time becomes a character in the story. Witnesses struggle to remember details from decades earlier. Old evidence must be explained carefully. Prosecutors must reconstruct moments that happened in a world that no longer quite exists. But in this case, one piece of evidence stood above everything else. Jason Miller's own confession. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution began by laying out the timeline that investigators had rebuilt step by step. Emily Carter left her house at 8:15 p.m. She stopped at a gas station just before 11. She drove to Pine Ridge Road expecting to meet someone she knew. Jason Miller. The two argued. A tire iron became a weapon. And Emily Carter never left that road alive. Jurors listened quietly as photographs of the scene were displayed on a large screen. Images of the forest road, the shallow grave discovered beneath layers of soil and pine needles, and the rusted tire iron that had rested beside Emily's remains for 20 years. The medical examiner testified next. She explained the skull fracture in careful, clinical terms. Blunt force trauma. A strike delivered with enough force to fracture bone. The kind of injury that could not be explained by a simple fall. Each word slowly dismantled the version of events Jason's defense team hoped to present. When Detective Reyes finally took the witness stand, the courtroom grew even quieter. He described reopening the cold case, the DNA recovered from Emily's car door, the moment Jason Miller admitted being on Pine Ridge Road, and finally, the confession that had ended 2 decades of silence. "I hit her," Reyes repeated for the jury. Those 3 words carried enormous weight. The defense tried to frame the story differently. They argued that Jason had been young, frightened, and overwhelmed during the argument, that Emily's death had been a tragic accident during a struggle, not a deliberate act of murder. But the prosecution returned again and again to the same facts. Jason had struck her. Jason had dragged her body into the woods. Jason had buried her. And Jason had spent 20 years lying about it. On the 7th day of the trial, the Carter family entered the courtroom knowing the case was almost over. Closing arguments were brief but powerful. The prosecutor stood before the jury and spoke plainly. "For 20 years," he said, "Emily Carter's family did not know what happened to their daughter. The man responsible for her death lived his life freely while they waited for answers." He paused before continuing. "But the truth does not stay buried forever." Across the courtroom, Jason Miller stared at the table in front of him. For the first time since the trial began, the weight of the evidence seemed visible on his face. The jury left to deliberate shortly after noon. Cold case trials sometimes produce quick verdicts. The passage of time often sharpens the clarity of evidence rather than weakening it. 3 hours later, the jurors returned. Everyone in the courtroom stood as the foreperson handed the verdict form to the judge. The silence that followed felt endless. Then the judge read the decision aloud. "Guilty." The word echoed softly through the room. Jason Miller closed his eyes. Behind him, Emily Carter's mother lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly as 20 years of waiting finally reached its end. The judge scheduled the sentencing hearing several weeks later. When that day arrived, the courtroom filled once more with the same quiet tension. Jason Miller stood again before the bench, no longer a suspect or a defendant. Now he was a convicted killer. The judge reviewed the evidence one final time before delivering the sentence. Emily Carter was 17 years old when her life was taken from her, the judge said. The defendant not only caused her death, but concealed that crime for 2 decades. He paused. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Jason Miller was sentenced to 35 years in prison. As deputies led him from the courtroom, he glanced briefly toward the gallery where Emily's family sat. But no words were exchanged. Some endings arrive without them. Later that evening, Detective Alan Reyes drove once more along Pine Ridge Road. The forest looked peaceful under the fading light of sunset. The same wind moved softly through the tall trees. If someone had passed by without knowing the story, they might never imagine the history hidden there. But for the people who had lived through the mystery, the road would always carry a memory, a reminder of the night a young girl disappeared, and the long journey it took to uncover the truth. Cold cases often fade into dusty files, their stories unfinished. But sometimes, through persistence, patience, and the quiet determination of investigators who refuse to let go, the past finally speaks. And when it does, even after 20 years of silence, the truth can still find its way back into the light.